Section 1. The Golden Throne and the Weight of 10,000 Years. There is a room beneath the Imperial Palace on Terra, buried under layers of stone and adamantium and 10,000 years of accumulated grief, that no ordinary human being has ever seen and returned from unchanged. It is not the largest room in the palace. It is not the most elaborately decorated. But it is the most important room in the known galaxy, and perhaps in all of existence, because inside that room sits a chair, a golden chair. And on that chair, held in place by ancient machines and the daily sacrifice of 1,000 human souls, sits something that was once a man. His name is the Emperor of Mankind. He has not moved in 10,000 years. He has not spoken in 10,000 years. His body is a ruin of desiccated flesh and crumbling bone, held together by the mechanisms of the Golden Throne, and by whatever iron-willed consciousness still burns somewhere inside that rotting shell. To look upon him, they say, is to see death wearing the memory of divinity. And yet, somehow, he still breathes. And somehow, impossibly, against every principle of biology and reason, he endures. This is the situation at the heart of the Warhammer 40,000 setting. An emperor who cannot rule, a god who cannot speak, a father who cannot comfort his children, even as those children die in their billions, across the cold, dark reaches of the galaxy in his name. The Imperium of Man is the largest and most powerful human civilization in history, but it is held together not by wisdom or innovation or prosperity. It is held together by faith in a corpse, by the faint psychic light of a mind that might, on any given day, finally fall silent forever. But what if that day never comes? What if something changes? What if, after 10 millennia of silence, the Emperor of Mankind opens his eyes? That is what we are here to explore today. Not the established lore of what will happen, because Games Workshop has deliberately left that question open, but the careful, grounded, deeply considered question of what it would mean, what it would look like, how the galaxy would respond, and whether it would even be a good thing if the Master of Mankind stirred in his chair and chose to come back. And I want to start by making sure we understand just how terrible and how extraordinary the current situation actually is. Because without that foundation, the idea of the Emperor waking up sounds like simple heroism. A wounded king recovering, a warrior rising from his sickbed. It sounds like the kind of story where everything gets better and the credits roll. It is not that story. It never was. The Golden Throne was never supposed to be a life support machine. Its original purpose was far grander and far more tragic than the role it was eventually forced to play. In the final decades before the Horus Heresy shattered the Imperium, the Emperor had conceived of something extraordinary. A secret project, hidden even from most of his Primarchs, which would render the entire practice of warp travel obsolete. He planned to give humanity access to the Webway, the ancient and impossibly vast network of tunnels through sub-reality that the Eldar had built in the depths of prehistory. The Webway connected every part of the galaxy instantaneously. No warp exposure, no navigator dependency, no risk of demonic intrusion or temporal distortion, just instant, safe, reliable travel between the stars. If successful, this project would have transformed the Imperium from a civilization held together by thin threads of chance and prayer into something genuinely unified, genuinely powerful, and genuinely safe. The Golden Throne was the key. It was an ancient device discovered by the Emperor during the Unification Wars, buried deep under the continent that would one day become part of the Imperial Palace. He spent decades modifying it, turning it into a portal, a node, a gateway into the Webway itself. And then the Magnus incident happened. The Primarch Magnus the Red, in a desperate attempt to warn his father about the betrayal of Horus, used forbidden sorcery of catastrophic power to breach the psychic wards around the Imperial Palace. In doing so, he destroyed the Emperor's Webway project from the inside out, tearing a wound in the fabric of reality directly beneath the palace that opened directly into the warp, releasing an endless flood of demonic entities into the Emperor's own home. The Emperor was forced to take his seat on the Golden Throne, not to use it for its intended purpose, but simply to hold that wound closed, to press a psychic hand against a bleeding artery and keep the darkness from pouring through. He has been sitting there ever since. By the time the Horus Heresy reached its climax, and the Emperor was finally struck down aboard Horus's flagship, His body was already devastated by years of maintaining the throne under battle conditions. When he was returned to Terra, there were only living cells enough left in his body for his consciousness to continue. The choices were stark and terrible. Let him die, and lose his psychic presence in the warp entirely, with all the catastrophic consequences that would bring. Or place him on the throne permanently, extending his existence indefinitely through the sacrifice of psychers, and accept that the greatest being humanity had ever produced would spend eternity as little more than a psychic generator in a decaying shell. They chose the throne, and so for over 10,000 years, 1,000 psychers have been brought to Terra every single day. They are the ones who could not be trained or controlled, the ones too weak to be sanctioned, too strong to simply be left alone. They come on great black ships called the Black Ships, crammed into the holds in their hundreds, stripped of their names and their dignity, fed into a machine, and they burn. Their souls, their life force, their psychic energy, all of it is absorbed into the Golden Throne, used to sustain the Emperor's failing body and power, the Astronomicon, the great psychic beacon that shines across the galaxy and makes warp navigation possible. 365,000 souls per year, around 3.65 billion souls per century. In 10,000 years of the Imperium as we know it, somewhere in the range of 36 billion human lives consumed to keep one man breathing. And still, the throne is failing. The Adeptus Mechanicus, who have been maintaining it since the very beginning, understand perhaps 10 or 15% of how it actually works. The rest is ritual and prayer and frantic improvisation. Critical systems are deteriorating. Subsystems are failing one by one. The tech priests speak of it in hushed, terrified tones, knowing that they are watching the slow death of a machine they cannot repair, and that when it finally stops working, the Imperium dies with it. So that is where we begin. That is the weight of what sits on that golden chair. Not a sleeping king waiting to be woken by a kiss, but a being who has been pressed against the walls of reality for over 10,000 years, holding back the darkness by sheer willpower, sustained by the death of millions, gradually losing his ability to do even that. And somewhere in all of that ruin and sacrifice and psychic agony, a question pulses like a heartbeat. What if he came back? Drop a comment right now and let me know where in the world you're watching from and what time it is where you are. I love seeing where this community reaches. And if you haven't subscribed yet, please do that now because we are just getting started and this one is going to take a while. Section 2. What the waking moment actually looks like. Let's slow everything down and think carefully about the mechanics of this, because the Emperor waking up is not as simple as someone snapping their fingers and him sitting up in the chair with his eyes open. The process of what that would actually look and feel like, both for him and for the wider galaxy, is one of the most fascinating parts of this whole thought experiment. The Emperor's physical body, as it exists today, cannot support independent life. That is not speculation, that is lore. His organs have long since ceased to function in any biological sense. His muscles have atrophied past the point of use. The desiccation of his tissues has gone far beyond what medicine or even superhuman biology could reverse through ordinary means. If you disconnected the Golden Throne right now, whatever was left of his physical shell would not awaken. It would simply finish dying. So, the first question we need to ask is, what kind of waking are we talking about? There are actually several distinct possibilities here, and they lead to wildly different scenarios. The first possibility is that the Emperor somehow heals his physical body while still seated on the throne. This is theoretically possible, given what we know about his nature as a perpetual. The Emperor was born a perpetual, meaning he is one of a rare category of human beings who cannot permanently die. They are killed, and then they regenerate. They have done this countless times throughout history. The Emperor himself lived for approximately 48,000 years before the Horus Heresy, dying and being reborn through violence or natural causes many times over that span, always returning to his preferred physical form. The question is whether being sustained artificially on the throne, essentially being kept at the edge of death rather than allowed to actually die, has prevented the perpetual regeneration cycle from activating. There are lore hints in various places that suggest this might be exactly what is happening, that the Golden Throne is paradoxically preventing the Emperor from healing by keeping him alive just enough to prevent the death that would trigger his natural regeneration. Like a wound that never quite bleeds enough to clot. If this is true, then the path to the Emperor's healing might actually run through a short, controlled death. Let him die, properly, completely, and trust that his perpetual nature will bring him back. This is connected to what is known in the older lore as the Star Child theory. The concept that a purified, more evolved form of the Emperor's consciousness exists within the warp, fed by the faith of trillions of believers, and that it is waiting to be reborn if only the physical shell can be allowed to finally expire. The Star Child, in this telling, would be the Emperor reborn, not simply as the psychic warrior and conqueror who built the Imperium, but as something more, something shaped by 10,000 years of worship, by the collective hope and devotion of hundreds of billions of human souls across the galaxy. A being vast and strange enough to be called a warp entity in his own right. A genuine god, in the same sense that the chaos powers are genuine gods. The second possibility is a more modest form of recovery, not a physical resurrection, but a return of active consciousness. The Emperor remains on the throne, his body still sustained artificially, but his mind comes back online in a meaningful way. He begins to communicate again, not through the distant whispers of the tarot and the vision dreams he occasionally sends to key figures, but directly. He speaks, he gives orders. He begins to reassert authority over the vast bureaucratic machine that has been running in his name without his guidance for 10,000 years. This version of the waking is quieter, and in some ways far more frightening than the dramatic resurrection. Because it means the Emperor is back, he is watching everything, and the Imperium as it currently exists is about to get a very thorough and probably very violent performance review. The third possibility is the most dramatic and the most discussed in fan circles. The Emperor fully heals. The throne is either repaired or made unnecessary by his recovery, and he physically rises from it. He stands, he walks. He steps out of the Sanctum Imperialis for the first time in 10,000 years and looks at what humanity has become. This is the full return, and the one that raises the most questions about what happens next. For the sake of this discussion, we are going to spend the most time on that third possibility, the full physical return, because it is the richest scenario and the one that touches on every single aspect of the setting. But we will keep the other two options in mind because they each contribute important angles to the question. So, let's say the Emperor wakes up, fully, physically, standing. What does he experience in that first moment? Think about what it would mean to be him in that instant. He has been sitting on that throne for 10,000 years, not sleeping, not peacefully dormant, conscious, aware, fighting every moment on the psychic battlefield of the warp, which exists outside of time in a way that is fundamentally different from the linear progression of reality. 10,000 years of continuous warfare against the forces of chaos, maintaining the Astronomicon, soul-binding psychers, pushing back demonic incursions. All of this experienced not as the slow passage of time, but as an unending, simultaneous, roaring storm of psychic violence and effort. The Emperor, on some level, has been experiencing something closer to an infinite moment than to a linear span of time. And then he opens his eyes, and he is in a room, and the room is quiet. The quiet alone would be staggering. After 10,000 years of the screaming of the warp in his mind, the relative stillness of the physical world would be almost overwhelming. He would be able to hear the mechanical breathing of the life support systems that are no longer needed. He would be able to feel the air of Terra on skin that has not felt air in 100 centuries. He would be able to see, through eyes that have been closed for 10 millennia, the interior of the Sanctum Imperialis, the golden walls, the incense smoke, the rows of silent custodians standing their eternal vigil. And then, because he is the Emperor of mankind and his first instinct has always been awareness, he would begin to take stock of what he knows. His psychic senses would reach outward, touching the galaxy, feeling the shape of it, the weight of it. And he would begin to understand what has happened in his absence. What he would find would be extraordinary and devastating in equal measure. He would feel the warp, different from how he left it, more turbulent. The Great Rift, that colossal tear in reality that ripped across the galaxy at the end of the 41st millennium, would be immediately apparent to him as a psychic wound of incomprehensible scale. Where once the Eye of Terror was the primary opening between the immaterium and real space, now there is something far larger, stretching from one side of the galaxy to the other, a jagged scar in the fabric of existence, through which the warp bleeds continuously into the material universe. He would recognize this as a catastrophic escalation of the situation he left behind. The barriers he spent 10,000 years trying to hold are not merely weakened. In a very real sense, they are partially gone. He would feel the Chaos Gods, four massive presences in the warp, aware of his waking in the same instant he becomes aware of them. More on that in a moment. He would feel his sons. The Primarchs. He would know which ones still exist, which ones have fallen, which ones are waiting somewhere in the galaxy. He would feel Roboute Guilliman, standing at the head of humanity's armies, carrying the weight of the Imperium on shoulders, built for war, but strained by 10,000 years of bureaucratic nightmare. He would feel the Lion, recently awoken, bristling with purpose. He would feel the corrupted ones, Magnus burning cold and blue in the planet of the sorcerers, Mortarion festering in his plague ship, Angron screaming with the eternal, lobotomized rage of the butcher's nails. Each of them would be immediately recognizable to him, like children whose voices you know before you see their faces. He would feel the scale of what has been lost, the fragmentation of the Imperium, the closing of borders, the burning of knowledge, the deliberate, systematic destruction of progress in the name of a religious faith built around his own silence. He would feel 10,000 years of atrophy and terror in the collective psyche of humanity, the way that endless war and constant fear have shaped the species he spent 50,000 years trying to guide and protect. And he would feel something else, something unexpected and profound. He would feel the faith. Trillions of human beings, across millions of worlds, praying to him every single day, not because they were ordered to, though they were, but because they genuinely believed. Because in the darkness of the 41st millennium, the idea that the Emperor was watching, was protecting, was caring, was the only light that many people had. The Imperial cult, the religion built in his name in direct contradiction of everything he spent his life trying to establish, would hit him like a physical force. The sheer magnitude of human belief, directed at him, accumulated over 10 millennia, would be almost more than even he could process. He would sit with all of that for a moment, that probably felt much longer to him than to anyone watching, and then he would begin to move. Section 3. The Imperium he finds 10,000 years of ruination and resilience. There is a deeply uncomfortable paradox at the heart of the Imperium of Man that anyone paying close attention to the lore eventually has to reckon with. The Imperium is, in many respects, the most powerful and successful human civilization that has ever existed. It spans the vast majority of the galaxy's habitable worlds. It fields armies and navies that are measured in the billions. It has endured for over 10,000 years against threats that would have shattered any lesser civilization in decades. In many ways, it is a remarkable achievement. And, in many other, deeper ways, it is a catastrophe. The Emperor, stepping out of that room, would confront an Imperium that bears almost no resemblance to what he intended to build. The civilization he envisioned during the Great Crusade was supposed to be rational, secular, and progressive. It was built on what he called the Imperial truth, an ideological framework that insisted on science over superstition, reason over faith, human potential over divine dependence. He wanted an Imperium that would grow, that would learn, that would develop technology and expand understanding, that would eventually evolve into a civilization capable of matching or surpassing anything the galaxy had ever seen. What he would find instead is something very different from that vision. The Imperium of the 41st and early 42nd millennia is, at its core, a theocratic death cult dressed in the trappings of secular empire. The state religion, the imperial cult, administered by the ecclesiarchy, teaches that the emperor is a god, that he always was a god, and that worshipping him correctly is the primary duty of every human being. The emperor, who personally oversaw the destruction of the last church on Terra and argued passionately for the elimination of all organized religion from the Imperium, would find his name on the lips of billions of priests, his image in every chapel, his supposed will invoked to justify everything from military genocide to the persecution of the gifted and the scholarly. The Adeptus Mechanicus, the organization responsible for maintaining technology across the Imperium, does not think of technology as technology. They think of it as the sacred. Machines are worshipped. Repair is a religious ritual. The acquisition of new knowledge is treated with deep suspicion because the accumulation of knowledge was what led to the Men of Iron rebellion in the dark age of technology, and the Mechanicus has spent 10,000 years systematically ensuring that nothing like that can ever happen again. The result is a civilization that can barely maintain the technology it inherited, let alone advance it. Weapons designs are 10,000 years old. Starship patterns are older still. The Imperium fights the enemies of humanity with equipment that their ancestors' ancestors used, because no one is allowed to innovate without jumping through an elaborate series of religious hoops that usually end in the innovation being declared heretical and burned. Knowledge itself is dangerous. Libraries are guarded, not to preserve their contents, but to control access to them. Entire fields of science have been declared heretical. The study of xenobiology, of warp physics, of alien history and culture, all of it is either forbidden outright or so tightly regulated as to be effectively impossible for anyone outside the most privileged circles of the Inquisition and the Adeptus Mechanicus. The ordinary citizen of the Imperium knows almost nothing about the universe they live in. They know that the Emperor protects. They know that aliens are to be exterminated on sight. They know that psychers are dangerous and probably should be reported. Everything else is either classified, burned, or simply never written down in the first place. The population of the Imperium is, depending on the source, somewhere between hundreds of billions and 1 trillion human beings. Most of them live in hive cities, vast urban constructions that tower into the atmosphere and plunge deep into the earth, home to tens of billions of people crammed into habitation blocks where a lifetime of grinding labor is the best that most can hope for. The middle and upper sections of the hive have decent conditions. The lower sections, the underhive, are something out of a nightmare, dark and violent, and abandoned by everything except the desperate and the criminal. The people who live in those places are, technically, subjects of the Emperor. In practice, they are forgotten. The political structure of the Imperium is a labyrinthine disaster. At the top, theoretically, are the High Lords of Terra, a council of 12 leaders drawn from the most powerful organizations in human space. The Lord Commander of the Astra Militarum, the Fabricator General of Mars, the Ecclesiarch, the Inquisitorial Representative. These 12 individuals are supposed to govern the Imperium in the Emperor's name, interpret his will, and ensure that his directives are followed. In practice, they spend most of their time in elaborate political maneuvering against each other, protecting their own organizational fiefdoms, and doing whatever is necessary to maintain their position on the council. Actual governance, in the sense of making things better for the people of the Imperium, is not really on anyone's agenda. Below the High Lords are the various Adeptus, the enormous bureaucratic arms of the imperial government that stretch across the entire galaxy and employ more people than most civilizations have ever had in their entire populations. The Administratum alone has billions of functionaries, spread across every world with a significant imperial presence, processing the paperwork that keeps the Imperium theoretically functioning. These organizations are ancient beyond reckoning, encrusted with 10,000 years of tradition, precedent, and internal politics. They are extraordinarily resistant to change. An order issued from Terra might take years to reach its destination, and by the time it gets there, the situation it was meant to address has usually changed entirely. Then there are the Space Marine chapters, the supreme warriors of the Imperium, created from the Emperor's own genetic material. There are approximately 1,000 chapters across the galaxy at any given time, each containing approximately 1,000 warriors of extraordinary capability. They are the most elite and most reliable military force humanity has ever produced. They are also deeply autonomous, largely self-governing, and loyal to the Emperor as an abstract principle, rather than to any living individual. After 10,000 years without a living emperor to defer to, the chapters have evolved into something approaching independent military orders, with their own culture, their own traditions, their own interpretations of duty and honor. Some of them are so old and so set in their ways that even the return of a Primarch has had only limited ability to redirect their priorities. And then there is the Inquisition, perhaps the most distinctive and most morally complex institution in the entire Imperium. Inquisitors are individuals granted extraordinary authority, answerable to no one but the Emperor himself, empowered to investigate and purge any threat to the Imperium, from demonic possession to internal corruption to alien infiltration. Their authority supersedes that of governors, generals, and even Space Marine chapter masters. They can requisition armies, order planetary bombardments, and execute anyone they consider a threat, all in the name of protecting humanity from dangers that most people do not even know exist. The Inquisition operates in the gray spaces between law and necessity, doing terrible things for defensible reasons and occasionally terrible things for no particularly good reason at all. It is effective. It is also, by any reasonable moral standard, deeply monstrous. This is the Imperium the Emperor would find, not the secular, rational, forward-looking civilization he imagined. Not a beacon of human potential, a theocratic, militaristic, deeply conservative organization held together by fear, faith, and a remarkable stubbornness about continuing to exist in the face of enemies that should, by any rights, have destroyed it centuries ago. He would recognize, with the clarity of a mind that has spent 10,000 years watching from beyond the veil of the material world, the impossible irony at the heart of it all. The religion built in his name, the very thing he spent his life fighting against, is probably the primary reason the Imperium is still standing. The Chaos Gods are fed by emotion, by despair and rage and desire and ambition. But faith, directed faith, faith in something that genuinely exists and genuinely opposes the ruinous powers, acts as a form of psychic protection. The billions of humans who pray to the Emperor every day are not simply being deluded. Their faith generates a genuine psychic force, a warmth in the warp that the darkness has more difficulty penetrating. The Emperor, as a rational man who understood the warp better than almost any being alive, would have to acknowledge that Lorgar, the Primarch he humiliated and punished for worshipping him, turned out to be right about one thing. Not about the Chaos Gods, those he led directly toward, but about the protective power of unified faith. The Emperor spent his life fighting religion because religion opened doors to chaos. But faith directed at himself, at a genuine psychic presence of extraordinary power, turns out to work differently. He would hate knowing that. And he would know it, immediately and completely, because that is the kind of mind he has. The question then becomes, what does he do about it? Section 4. The Physical and Psychic Resurrection. What the Emperor becomes. This section requires us to think very carefully about what the Emperor actually is, and how 10,000 years of existing in his current condition might have changed him. Because the being who rises from the Golden Throne, if he rises, is not going to be the same man who sat down on it. The Emperor before the Horus heresy was already extraordinary, beyond ordinary human comprehension. He was, according to established lore, born around 8,000 years before the modern Common Era, somewhere in Anatolia, in what is now modern Turkey. He was born a perpetual, and from the very beginning of his life, he possessed psychic abilities that grew stronger with every passing century and every death and rebirth. He remembered his past lives, accumulated their knowledge, carried forward everything he had learned. By the time he emerged onto the galactic stage and began the unification wars on Terra, he had been alive for approximately 40,000 years. He had been a philosopher, a king, a general, a scientist, 1,000 things across 1,000 lifetimes. He had watched civilizations rise and fall. He had fought wars that are now completely forgotten. He had accumulated a store of knowledge and understanding that no ordinary human being could equal in 100 lifetimes. Even then, before the throne, before the heresy, before all of it, the Emperor was described as something that had clearly transcended ordinary humanity while still being, in some essential way, human. He had emotions, ambitions, blind spots, and failures. He was proud. He was sometimes cruel in his certainty. He made enormous mistakes, the worst of which probably contributed directly to the Horus heresy itself. He was, in other words, not a perfect being. He was a very, very old and very, very powerful being who was trying his absolute best and sometimes getting it badly wrong. Now consider what 10,000 years on the Golden Throne has done to him. For 10,000 years, his mind has been submerged in the warp, not dipping into it, not making brief excursions into the immaterium, but existing within it, maintaining a continuous presence in the sea of psychic energy that underlies all reality. The warp is a place where emotion shapes reality, where thought has substance, where the collective dreams and nightmares of every sentient being in the galaxy take physical form. For 10,000 years, trillions of humans have been directing their most profound and sincere devotion directly at him. Their faith, their hope, their desperate need for protection, all of it has been flowing into the warp and finding its way to his psychic presence there. The Chaos Gods grew to their current stature through a similar process. They are, at their core, psychic entities shaped by the collective emotional output of living beings. Khorne was made by rage and war. Nurgle was made by despair and the acceptance of death. Tzeentch was made by ambition and the desire for change. Slaanesh was made by pleasure and excess. They are projections, given consciousness by the sheer volume and intensity of the emotions that created them. The Emperor has been receiving, for 10,000 years, a comparable volume of psychic energy. Not the dark emotions that feed chaos, but something different. Hope, love, devotion, sacrifice. The willingness to die for something greater than yourself. The faith that the darkness can be held back. All of this has been flowing into the warp and finding his presence there. The being who rises from the Golden Throne may, in a very real sense, have become something genuinely new. Not just a more powerful version of the man who sat down, but a being who has been shaped by 10 millennia of accumulated devotion, evolved by the weight of trillions of prayers, and transformed by the experience of existing in the warp for longer than most civilizations have lasted. There are theories within the lore that the Emperor is not weakening on the throne, but evolving, that the apparent deterioration of his physical form is actually a chrysalis phase, that he is becoming something that the current form of the throne and the current state of his physical body cannot fully contain. If that is true, then the Emperor who wakes up might be something that has never existed before in the history of the galaxy. Not a man, not a god in the chaos sense, but a genuine psychic entity of such immense power and such profoundly different nature that the very concepts we use to understand power might not fully apply to him anymore. The Chaos Gods are powerful because they are made of darkness, because they feed on the worst of what sentient beings produce. The Emperor, if the evolutionary theory is correct, would be powerful because he is made of something opposite, because he has been fed for 10,000 years by the best of what humanity produces. The practical implications of this are staggering. On the physical level, when the Emperor rises from the throne, the first thing that would happen is the immediate cessation of the Astronomicon as currently constituted. The beacon currently functions through the Emperor's psychic presence, mediated by the machinery of the throne and the sacrifice of psychers. If the Emperor is free of the throne, if he is standing and walking, and fully present in the physical world, the Astronomicon does not simply stop, it transforms. It becomes a direct projection of his will and his power, rather than a mediated, machine-assisted broadcast. The immediate effect would probably be an enormous surge of psychic light across the galaxy, the Astronomicon going from a distant star to something closer to a second sun in the psychic sky. Every navigator in the galaxy would feel it. Every psyker would feel it. Every warp entity would feel it. And in the dungeons beneath the Imperial Palace, the great golden doors that the Emperor has been holding closed for 10,000 years would need to be secured by something other than his direct attention. This is potentially catastrophic. The moment he stands up, the warp portal beneath the palace becomes unguarded. The daemons that have been pressing against it for 10,000 years would surge forward instantly. The first act of the Emperor's resurrection might need to be sealing that door through some other means, possibly by destroying it entirely with the full force of his recovered psychic power, or by establishing a permanent psychic ward strong enough to hold without his constant attention. On the psychic level, the Emperor's return would be felt across the entire galaxy in minutes. The warp does not transmit information at the speed of light. It transmits it at the speed of significance. The awakening of a being of his stature in the material world would send a shockwave through the immaterium that every sensitive mind in existence would feel immediately. Astropaths on the far side of the galaxy would scream and weep and babble about golden light. navigators would lose their bearings for a terrifying moment as the entire psychic landscape rearranged itself. Psychers of every description would feel it like a physical blow, a sudden awareness of an overwhelming presence that had not been there a moment before. The Chaos Gods would feel it, and they would react. We will get to that in considerable detail in the next section, because their reaction is one of the most important consequences of the Emperor's return, and it deserves careful attention. But before we get there, let us sit for a moment with the question of the Emperor's own state of mind, because the being who rises from that throne carries something that pure power cannot account for. He carries 10,000 years of witnessing from the inside of the warp, everything that has been done in his name, every atrocity committed by the Inquisition, every life consumed on the black ships, every world burned by order of a cardinal who never questioned whether burning it was right, every person executed for the crime of being a mutant, or a psyker, or simply someone whose difference frightened the people around them. The Emperor has been aware, in whatever mediated way the warp allows, of all of this. And if there is anything of the man he was before still present inside that resurrected form, he would be carrying the weight of it. He would be furious, grief-stricken, resolved. And the Imperium would have no idea what was about to happen. Section 5. The Chaos Gods respond 4 powers against 1. This is the part of the discussion that most people jump to immediately, and honestly, I understand why. The prospect of the Emperor, freed from the Golden Throne, finally able to bring his full and unmediated power to bear against the ruinous powers, is one of the most viscerally exciting ideas in all of Warhammer 40,000. And the reaction of the 4 Chaos Gods to his awakening is genuinely one of the most important questions in the entire scenario. So, let us think through this carefully, starting with what the Chaos Gods actually are, and what their relationship to the Emperor has always been. Khorne is the Blood God, the oldest and in many ways the most straightforwardly powerful of the 4. He was born from rage and violence, from every act of war and murder committed by every sentient being in the galaxy, and he has been fed by 10,000 years of the most intense sustained warfare in galactic history. The Horus Heresy alone gave him enough blood to sustain a lesser god for an eternity. The long war that followed, the constant grinding attrition of the 41st millennium, all of those trillions of deaths, in all of those conflicts, across all of those worlds, Khorne has been growing fat on all of it. He sits on a throne of skulls in the warp, and his throne is very tall. Tzeentch is the changer of ways, the architect of destiny, the being who knows more about the possible futures of every living creature in the galaxy than those creatures know about their own pasts. He is made of ambition and change, and the endless longing for something different, something better, something more. He is the most cunning of the 4 gods, and the hardest to understand, because his plans contain plans within plans within plans, and his goals are often inscrutable even to himself. Tzeentch has been watching the Emperor with enormous interest since long before the Golden Throne. He was the architect of at least part of the chain of events that led to the Horus Heresy, working through Magnus the Red, through chaos cults, through the subtle manipulation of destiny that is his primary art. The possibility of the Emperor waking up is, for Tzeentch, not simply a threat, but an extraordinary opportunity. Change, after all, is his domain, and nothing in the history of the galaxy would represent a greater change than the return of the master of mankind. Nurgle is the Plague Father, the god of disease and entropy, and the strange, rot-scented comfort of accepting death. He is the most patient of the 4 gods, the one who works on the longest timescales, the one who sees the decay of civilizations as a form of beauty. Nurgle has always had a particular relationship with humanity, because humanity fears death with more intensity and more desperation than almost any other species in the galaxy, and that fear is food and water to him. The Imperium, with its desperate, doomed attempts to hold back the inevitable collapse of a civilization too vast and too rigid to reform itself, is in some ways Nurgle's greatest ongoing triumph. He has watched the Imperium rot from within for 10,000 years, patiently, lovingly, the way a gardener watches a compost heap slowly transform into something fertile and teeming with life. Slaanesh is the youngest of the 4, born from the ecstasy and excess of the Eldar at the height of their civilization's decadence, and the most immediately dangerous to the Eldar species in particular. But Slaanesch's interests are not limited to the Eldar. Any pursuit of sensation taken to its logical and terrible extreme feeds the Prince of Chaos, the obsessive pursuit of military perfection, the addictive comfort of faith that never demands thought, the pleasure of power over others. All of these feed Slaanesh, and the Imperium, for all its austerity, provides these things in enormous quantities. These four entities have, throughout the history of the Imperium, been united in only one goal: the destruction of the Emperor of mankind. They are not, by nature, cooperative. They hate each other with a passion that has been called the Great Game, an eternal contest for supremacy within the warp that consumes most of their attention most of the time. But the Emperor represents a threat to all four of them simultaneously, and this is the one circumstance in which they will temporarily set aside their rivalry to pursue a common target. This happened during the Horus Heresy, when all four gods combined their power and attention to orchestrate the near downfall of the Imperium. It can happen again. The Emperor's awakening would trigger an immediate response from all four, but the nature of each response would be different. Khorne's response would be the most direct and the least subtle. He would send his greatest champions. Bloodthirsters of the highest order, demons of incredible martial power, would surge through every available warp rift toward the nearest points of materialization in the physical world. Khorne does not negotiate. He does not scheme. He sends warriors, and he sends enough of them to crush whatever is in front of them. The challenge for him is that the Emperor, returned to full strength, is one of the greatest warriors in the history of the galaxy. He fought Horus to mutual devastation at the height of his power. He has spent 10,000 years learning to wage war in the warp. A straight fight between the Emperor and Khorne's greatest champions is not the foregone conclusion it would be for any other being in existence. Tzeentch's response would be the most dangerous long-term. Tzeentch has already been planning for the possibility of the Emperor's awakening for longer than human civilization has existed. He would have contingencies within contingencies, webs of manipulation already in place, individuals already positioned to act as his instruments at the crucial moment. The thing about Tzeentch is that the Emperor's awakening is, in a sense, exactly what Tzeentch wants, because change is what he is. A galaxy where the Emperor has returned and everything is different is a galaxy where Tzeentch's power is surging. But he would want to shape that change in ways that serve his purposes, and the Emperor, more than any other being alive, would be capable of recognizing and disrupting Tzeentchian schemes. Nurgle's response would be the most insidious and the most dangerous to the Imperium's population rather than to the Emperor himself. When Nurgle becomes aware of a new threat to his patient gardening of human civilization, he does not strike directly. He sends plagues. New diseases of extraordinary virulence and warp-enhanced spread, tailored to overwhelm the Imperium's medical infrastructure, to spread despair and helplessness through populations that are already weakened by the psychological shock of their god's return, to undermine the very foundations of physical human resistance. The Death Guard, under Mortarion, would be mobilized, and Mortarion himself, the Emperor's most resentful and in some ways most tragic son, would be driven by something more personal than mere strategic calculation. Slaanesh's response would be the most psychically targeted. Slaanesh understands temptation, the seductive whisper that turns strength into weakness. The Emperor's return would give the Prince of Pleasure enormous material to work with. What does the Emperor desire? What does he fear? What void in his ancient heart could be exploited? Slaanesh would be looking for those pressure points with extraordinary focus, because destabilizing the Emperor psychically, making him doubt his course, making him hesitate at the crucial moment, could be more effective than any purely military approach. But here is the thing that all four Chaos Gods would need to reckon with, and the thing that the more pessimistic fan theories often overlook. The Emperor returning to full strength after 10,000 years in the warp is not simply a return to the status quo ante. He is not the same being who sat down on that throne. He has been, as we explored in the previous section, feeding on the psychic energy of humanity's faith for 10 millennia. He has been fighting on the battlefield of the warp, where the Chaos Gods themselves are most powerful, for the entire duration of his apparent incapacitation. He knows the Chaos Gods far better now than he did during the Horus Heresy, because he has been their intimate, if unwilling, neighbor for 10,000 years. He knows their strategies, their weaknesses, their blind spots. And here is the critical point that is easy to miss. The Chaos Gods are made of emotions that will always exist: rage, despair, ambition, desire. These are fundamental components of consciousness. You cannot eliminate them. You cannot destroy the gods by destroying their power source, because the power source is sentient life itself. The Emperor understood this, and it shaped his entire strategy during the Great Crusade. He was not trying to destroy the Chaos Gods. He was trying to make humanity strong enough, united enough, rational enough, that the dark emotions that fed them would diminish. A humanity that lived without irrational fear would feed Nurgle less. A humanity without pointless war would weaken Khorne. A humanity without endless, frustrated ambition would starve Tzeentch. 10,000 years of theocratic, militaristic horror have done the exact opposite of all that. The Imperium feeds the Chaos Gods magnificently. Its fear feeds Nurgle. Its endless wars feed Khorne. Its frustrated ambitions and desperate plotting feed Tzeentch. Its obsessive pursuit of military and spiritual perfection feeds Slaanesh. The Chaos Gods are arguably stronger now than they have ever been. A resurrected emperor trying to fight them directly would be fighting them at the peak of their power, which is not strategically optimal, to say the least. So the Emperor, thinking with the clarity of a mind that has been watching this situation develop from inside the warp for 10,000 years, would understand that the direct military approach, as satisfying as it might be, is not sufficient by itself. Something more fundamental needs to change about the nature of the Imperium and its relationship with humanity. And that brings us, inevitably, to the question of what he does to the institution that has been running everything in his name. Section 6. The Primarchs' Reunion, Reckoning, and Redemption. The relationship between the Emperor and his Primarchs is one of the most emotionally charged dynamics in the entire Warhammer 40,000 setting. These were his sons, in the most meaningful sense of the word, created from his own genetic material, shaped by his own psychic power, sent out into the galaxy to conquer it in his name. Each of them was a demigod in their own right, a being of superhuman capability and profound personality, carrying aspects of the Emperor's own nature, magnified and distilled into a single form. And yet, in the end, 9 of them turned against him, and the consequences of that betrayal shaped the galaxy for 10,000 years. By the time of the Emperor's awakening, the Primarch situation is this. Of the loyal Primarchs, 2 are confirmed active. Roboute Guilliman, the Primarch of the Ultramarines, was resurrected during the events of the Gathering Storm through the combined efforts of the Ynneri, Belisarius Cawl, and circumstances that the Chaos Gods themselves might have looked at and said were suspicious. He serves as the Lord Commander of the Imperium, the Imperial Regent, the closest thing to a functioning executive authority that the Imperium has had since the Emperor fell. He is, by all accounts, exhausted and frustrated, and deeply aware that no single being, even a Primarch, can fix in years what went wrong over 10,000. He has been fighting the Indomitus Crusade, leading the charge to stabilize the Imperium after the opening of the Great Rift, arguing with the High Lords, arguing with the Ecclesiarchy, trying to reform institutions that have had 10,000 years to calcify into something almost immovable. Lion L. Johnson, the Primarch of the Dark Angels, recently awakened from his long slumber within the rock, the Dark Angels' mobile fortress monastery. The Lion is back, and his return has already made an impression by doing something Guilliman had not managed, which is physically throwing the Daemon Primarch Angron across a battlefield. The Lion is complex in a way that is going to become enormously relevant when the Emperor returns, because the Lion's entire psychological profile is built around secrecy, around the slow revelation of truth at the moment it becomes most useful, around a kind of strategic patience that can look like cowardice until it suddenly looks like genius. He and Guilliman already have an uneasy relationship because their approaches to the problems of the Imperium are so different. Of the missing Primarchs, several are believed to potentially still exist somewhere in the galaxy. Leman Russ, the Primarch of the Space Wolves, rode into the Eye of Terror with a small retinue and promised to return for the final battle. The Space Wolves have been searching for him ever since. Jagatai Khan, the Primarch of the White Scars, vanished into the webway during a pursuit of Dark Eldar raiders, and has not been definitively confirmed dead. Vulcan, the Primarch of the Salamanders, is a perpetual like his father, and has died and returned many times throughout his history, and there are tantalizing hints scattered through the lore that he may still be out there. Corvus Corax, the Raven Guard's Primarch, spent time hunting Chaos forces through the Webway and the Eye of Terror, and his status is similarly ambiguous. And then there are the traitors. Magnus the Red, the Primarch of the Thousand Suns, is a daemon prince of Tzientch, commanding sorcerous power from the planet of the sorcerers in the Eye of Terror. His fall is one of the most tragic in the entire Horus Heresy narrative, because Magnus's betrayal was accidental. He was trying to warn his father about Horus's corruption, and the method he used caused the catastrophe that led to his fall. He is fiercely, genuinely intelligent, possessed of genuine grief and guilt about what he became, but also utterly and perhaps permanently committed to his path now. His relationship with the Tzientchian powers he serves is complicated by his genuine love for knowledge for its own sake, as opposed to Tzientch's love for change for its own sake, and this tension has defined his existence since the burning of Prospero. Mortarion, the Primarch of the Death Guard, and now a daemon prince of Nurgle, is perhaps the most complicated of all the traitor Primarchs. His fall was not a moment of dramatic seduction, but the culmination of a lifetime's worth of resentment and despair. He had been a child slave on a world ruled by sorcerers. He had built his life around the absolute rejection of psychic power, around a pure, grinding, physical toughness that relied on nothing supernatural. And then his own father turned out to be the greatest psyker in history, and the galaxy turned out to be full of warp horror at every level. And all of his hard-won contempt for the supernatural was shown to be a wish more than a reality. Nurgle, who is the god of accepting death and despair, spoke to something in Mortarion that nothing else ever had. The Emperor's return would be uniquely painful for Mortarion, because the father he resented for the entirety of his mortal life would be standing again, and everything he had done since his fall would be seen in that light. Angron, the Primarch of the World Eaters and Daemon Prince of Khorne, is the saddest story of all, and perhaps the one where the Emperor's guilt is most directly implicated. Angron was enslaved before the Emperor found him, fitted with cybernetic implants called the Butcher's Nails that drove him to constant frenzied rage by suppressing the neurological pathways that allow pleasure, contentment, or peace. He was a gladiator by necessity, fighting because the alternative was death, fighting because the nails made him incapable of choosing not to. The Emperor found him at the moment when he was about to die, in a last, defiant battle alongside the slaves who had become his family, and rather than letting that moment complete itself, the Emperor teleported him away to safety. Angron never forgave him. He never forgave being taken from the only people who had ever mattered to him, delivered to a life of conquest in the name of an Imperium he had never chosen. Khorne's power gave him what the Emperor never did, the full, unhindered expression of the rage that had been building in him since childhood. When the Emperor returns, the prospect of facing Angron, really facing him, is one of the most emotionally devastating things to contemplate. The meeting between the resurrected Emperor and his sons, loyal and traitor alike, would be one of the defining moments in the history of the galaxy. Each relationship is unique. Each carries its own weight of history and betrayal and love and loss. Guilliman, who never stopped believing in the Imperium but has spent 10,000 years watching it fall short of everything it was supposed to be, would feel the relief of an impossible burden being shared. The Lion, who holds his secrets like weapons, would need to decide which of those secrets were still worth keeping. Magnus, who loves and hates his father with equal intensity, would be pulled in directions that even Tzientch's schemes might not fully account for. The question that hangs over all of them is whether the Emperor, changed as he is, would approach these reunions the same way he approached his relationships with his sons before. His failure to communicate, to trust, to explain, to listen, was one of the central factors in the Horus Heresy. He kept secrets from the Primarchs that he should have shared. He punished loyalty confused for heresy and overlooked heresy disguised as loyalty. He was, for all his power and wisdom, a father who was not quite capable of being the father his sons needed. Does 10,000 years of watching from the warp change that? Does the weight of what his silence cost give him the capacity for a different kind of relationship with those who remain? That question is at the heart of whether the Emperor's return saves the Imperium or simply transforms the nature of its crisis. Section 7. The Inquisition, the Ecclesiarchy, and the Crisis of Faith. The return of the emperor would create an immediate and severe institutional crisis, and the two organizations most directly affected would be the Inquisition and the Ecclesiarchy. Understanding this requires understanding what each of these institutions actually is and what function they serve. The Ecclesiarchy, the Church of the God Emperor of mankind, is the state religion of the Imperium and one of its most powerful and most deeply embedded institutions. Its power derives from one fundamental fact, that the emperor cannot speak for himself. The Ecclesiarchy speaks for him. Interpretation of the emperor's will, the determination of what constitutes heresy, the management of the enormous religious infrastructure that spans the entire Imperium, all of this sits with the Ecclesiarchy and its leader, the Ecclesiarch, who holds one of the 12 seats on the High Lords of Terra. The Ecclesiarchy's authority is built on silence. It requires the emperor to be unreachable, unknowable, accessible only through prayer and scripture and the mediation of his priests. The moment the emperor starts talking, the Ecclesiarchy's monopoly on his interpretation collapses immediately. Every ecclesiarchal decree issued over the last 10,000 years becomes immediately subject to review. Every doctrine, every prohibition, every holy war called in the emperor's name would need to be evaluated against what the emperor actually says and wants. The implications of this are almost too vast to fully enumerate. Consider just a few examples. The emperor, in his pre-heresy life, was absolutely, vehemently, uncompromisingly anti-religion. He oversaw the destruction of the last church on Terra. He publicly humiliated Lorgar for writing a text about his divinity. He insisted repeatedly and passionately that he was not a god, that gods did not exist in the benevolent sense that most religions implied, and that the worship of supernatural beings was a direct invitation to the corruption that the chaos gods represented. When the emperor returns and sees the Ecclesiarchy, the first thing he would do is recognize it as the exact thing he spent his entire life fighting against. The institutional worship of himself, conducted with all the pomp and brutality and intolerance that organized religion at its worst, has always exhibited. He would, with absolute certainty, want to dismantle it. But here is the terrible paradox we touched on earlier. The faith of those billions of worshippers is not without genuine psychic power. It generates real protection in the warp. Shattering it abruptly might do enormous damage to the psychic defenses of ordinary humans who have no other protection against demonic influence. The Emperor, with his 10,000 years of watching the warp, would understand this. He would not simply order the dissolution of the Church in the first hour. But neither would he continue to allow his name to be used to justify the burning of scholars and the persecution of psychers and the political power of an institution that exists to serve its own authority rather than to genuinely protect humanity. The Inquisition's situation is more nuanced. The Inquisition, in its original conception, was actually the Emperor's idea, or at least the idea of his closest advisor, Malcador the Sigillite. It was built precisely to do the things that needed doing but could not be done through official channels, to investigate threats that official institutions were too visible or too compromised to handle. There is a legitimate function to what the Inquisition does. The threats it faces are real. The methods it uses are extreme, but the extreme methods are not always unjustifiable given the scale of the threats. The problem is 10,000 years without a check on its authority. The Inquisition answers to the Emperor, but the Emperor has been silent. This means, in practice, that the Inquisition answers to nobody. Individual inquisitors have enormous discretion. Their judgment is the final judgment in their operational area. And while many inquisitors are genuinely dedicated, genuinely brilliant, genuinely committed to protecting humanity at any cost, the institutional structure that allows inquisitors this level of unsupervised authority is also capable of producing monsters, not in the fantasy sense, but in the banal, organizational sense. People who genuinely believe they are doing good while doing terrible things, because no one has the authority to tell them otherwise. The Emperor's return would fundamentally alter the Inquisition's situation. He is the authority they nominally answer to. He is the one whose will they are supposed to be carrying out. The Inquisition cannot simply ignore the returned Emperor the way it ignores the High Lords of Terra when convenient. But neither can it simply defer to him on everything, because the Inquisition operates in the shadows, in the spaces between official channels, and a physically present emperor changes the nature of those shadows. There would be factions within both organizations, within the ecclesiarchy and within the Inquisition, who would embrace the emperor's return genuinely and completely. For many true believers, the literal physical return of their God would be the fulfillment of prophecy, the answer to every prayer ever uttered in his name. These individuals would be among his most fervent supporters, and there would be factions who would resist, who would see the returned emperor as a threat to their own power and position, who would begin maneuvering immediately to limit, control, or delegitimize him. 10,000 years of institutional inertia does not evaporate overnight, even in the face of a miracle. The High Lords of Terra have spent 10,000 years governing in the Emperor's name. The prospect of the Emperor actually governing his own empire might not be entirely welcome to all of them. Consider the ecclesiarch specifically. The head of the Imperial Church would face an impossible situation. The Emperor has returned. This should be the greatest moment in the history of their faith. But the Emperor has returned as a man who disagrees with almost everything the Church teaches, who hates the institution they lead, who, given what we know of his character, would probably tell them very directly that they have been doing tremendous harm in his name and he wants it to stop. That ecclesiarch would have a choice. Embrace the returned emperor and accept the demolition of their institution's power and doctrine, or resist. And the Inquisition is full of people who would be very interested in helping with that resistance if the price was right. The political situation on Terra in the immediate aftermath of the Emperor's awakening would be one of extraordinary tension and danger, miraculous and terrible in equal measure. Section 8. The Emperor wages war. The new crusade begins. At some point, the Emperor would stop taking stock and start acting. And when he acts, the galaxy will shake. The question of how the Emperor would approach warfare after 10,000 years as the most powerful being in the warp is fascinating. He is not the same warrior he was during the Great Crusade. He was magnificent then, the greatest individual combatant in the history of humanity, armored in masterwork Terminator plate, wielding weapons of staggering power, teleporting onto enemy ships in personal combat, engaging Horus aboard the Vengeful Spirit in a duel that shook reality. All of that capability would still be there, probably enhanced by his 10,000 years of psychic evolution. But he would also be a strategist of incomparable depth and experience, and he would know that winning individual battles, however spectacular, is not how you win the kind of war the Imperium needs to win. The war he needs to fight is not primarily military. It is cultural and psychic and political. That said, the military component is not irrelevant. The Great Rift is open. Daemon worlds exist. Chaos Space Marines raid across the galaxy. Xenos threats press in from every direction. An emperor walking the galaxy and leaving battlefields in his wake would accomplish two things. First, it would deal with actual military threats in a way that no other entity in the galaxy can match. Second, and perhaps more importantly, it would function as the most powerful piece of propaganda in the history of the Imperium. Billions of people would see or hear about the Emperor, walking, fighting, winning. The effect on morale, on faith, on the willingness of ordinary human beings to keep fighting against impossible odds would be incalculable. There is a concept in the lore called a War of Faith, a campaign called by the ecclesiarchy in the Emperor's name, drawing forces from across the Imperium and channeling the religious fervor of entire star systems into a coherent military effort. The most famous War of Faith in Imperium history was the one that ended the Age of Apostasy, when a reforming ecclesiarch named Sebastian Thor led a coalition against the tyrant Gog Vandir. But a War of Faith, called by the Emperor himself, not in the Emperor's name, but by the Emperor, physically present and speaking, would be something that has never existed before. It would be, in effect, a third Great Crusade. But unlike the first two Great Crusades, this one would have the Emperor personally involved, personally leading, personally deciding what should be fought and what should be reformed. The traitor Primarchs would be the priority targets. Not because defeating them would end the threat of chaos, because it would not. The Chaos Gods would simply create new daemon princes in their place. But because the traitor Primarchs represent specific, identifiable sources of harm, Mortarian's Death Guard have been spreading plagues across the Imperium for 10,000 years. Magnus has launched invasion after invasion. Angron has butchered entire systems. Each of them is a wound in the galaxy that needs addressing. But the Emperor's approach to the traitors would not be simple, because some of them, particularly Magnus and Mortarian, are not simple figures of pure evil. They are his sons. They fell because of circumstances that the Emperor himself had a hand in creating. The Emperor's uncharacteristic willingness to share blame and acknowledge failure, if his 10,000 years of watching has given him anything like that, would be tested by the question of how to handle the traitor Primarchs. Magnus, in particular, is a fascinating case. His fall was accidental, triggered by an attempt to serve his father. He is enormously intelligent, genuinely regrets his path, and is motivated primarily by a love of knowledge that Tzeentch has spent 10,000 years exploiting. Is there redemption available for Magnus? The lore is deliberately ambiguous on this, but the return of the Emperor would open that question in a new way. A confrontation between the Emperor and Magnus would be unlike any other encounter in the scenario. It would not be simply a battle. It would be a reckoning, a conversation between a father and a son about choices made and consequences suffered, with the fate of perhaps millions of people hanging on the outcome. The logistics of a new crusade would be extraordinary. The Imperium under Guilliman has already been running the Indomitus Crusade, a massive military campaign to stabilize Imperial space after the Great Rift. The Emperor's return would transform that from a desperate holding action into something more coherent. Because the Emperor, unlike Guilliman, does not have to work within the constraints of the existing Imperium. He is the Imperium. His word is law not because he holds political office, but because he is the being the entire edifice was built around. He can redirect resources, restructure military priorities, override political objections, in ways that even Roboute Guilliman cannot. But the most important campaign the Emperor would wage is not on a physical battlefield. It is on the battlefield of culture and governance. The reformation of the Imperium, the dismantling of the structures that have been crushing humanity's potential for 10,000 years, the rebuilding of something that might actually achieve what he originally intended. That is a campaign that will take longer than any war, and it will be resisted by everything he has built, turned against everything it was meant to be. Section 9. The alien powers react Eldar, Necrons, Tau, and the Tyrannid Tide. The Emperor's return would not affect only humanity. Every major power in the galaxy would need to respond to it, and each of those responses would shape the new political landscape of the galaxy in fundamental ways. The Eldari, the ancient and dwindling remnants of a civilization that once dominated the galaxy, have the most complicated relationship with the Emperor's return of any non-human species. For one thing, the Eldari's own god, the nascent deity Yenade, the god of the dead, has been slowly gathering power within the warp, fed by the souls of dead Eldar, in a process that is conceptually parallel to the Emperor's own evolution on the Golden Throne. The Winari faction, led by Yvraine and the Visarch, are working to awaken Yenade as a counter to Slaanesh, and as a way to ensure the survival of the Eldar species. They were instrumental in resurrecting Guilliman, which represents one of the most significant direct interventions by an alien faction in Imperial politics in the setting's history. The craft-world Eldar have traditionally held a complicated attitude toward humanity, ranging from grudging respect to outright contempt, depending on the craft world and the individual Farseer. They are extraordinarily long-lived, extraordinarily psychically powerful, and carry within their culture the memory of what it was like to be a civilization that dominated the galaxy in its prime. They look at humanity and see something both enormously promising and terrifyingly dangerous, a species with enormous psychic potential and the emotional volatility of a teenager with access to weapons. The return of the Emperor, a being of enough psychic power to match or exceed some of the most powerful Eldar seers who have ever lived, would command their attention in a new way. Some Farseers would see the Emperor's return as the fulfillment of ancient prophecies about a younger race rising to lead the defense of the galaxy against the final darkness. Others would see it as a destabilizing event of the highest order, a shift in the psychic balance of the galaxy that could have consequences impossible to fully predict, even for Eldar precognition. The most politically astute of the Craftworlders would begin seeking contact with the returned Emperor, not out of any fondness for humanity, but out of the recognition that in a galaxy increasingly dominated by chaos, a living Emperor walking and fighting is an asset that no being with access to him should waste. The Necrons present perhaps the most fascinating response scenario. They are the galaxy's original inhabitants in a meaningful sense, ancient beyond measure, their civilization predating humanity by millions of years. Their current state, cold metallic constructs dreaming of returning to organic life, is the result of the war in heaven, a conflict so ancient and so total that it literally shaped the structure of the warp itself. The Silent King, Sarek, has been building the Pariah Nexus, a vast network of anti-psychic technology designed to suppress the warp across entire star systems, as part of his plan to eventually seal the warp away from reality entirely. This plan would protect the Necrons perfectly, since they have no souls and are unaffected by the warp, but it would also slowly extinguish the psychic connection that every other sentient species in the galaxy depends on. The Emperor's return would put him in immediate direct conflict with the Silent King's project. Both of them want to secure the galaxy from chaos. They agree on the problem, but their solutions are diametrically opposed. The Emperor's solution requires a living psychic humanity that can hold the line against the warp through its own evolved spiritual power. The Silent King's solution requires eliminating the warp's influence on real space entirely, which would be catastrophic for psychers, for navigators, for the Astronomicon, and for everything that depends on psychic connection to function. A conversation between the Emperor of Mankind and the Silent King of the Necrons would be one of the most extraordinary diplomatic encounters in the history of the galaxy. Two beings of incomprehensible age, both profoundly certain that they understand the universe in ways that other beings do not, both genuinely trying to secure the future for their respective peoples, but with approaches so fundamentally incompatible that cooperation seems impossible, except that both of them are also intelligent enough to recognize that destroying each other would simply hand victory to chaos and the Tyranids, which neither of them wants. The shape of whatever agreement or standoff they would reach would define the political geometry of the galaxy for the next age. The Tau, the youngest major civilization in the galaxy, would have a response shaped by their characteristic pragmatism. The Tau do not have a significant psychic presence in the warp. Their philosophy of the greater good, their commitment to collective advancement, and the careful application of technology has more in common superficially with the Emperor's pre-heresy vision of the Imperium than with what the Imperium actually became. They are also, in galactic terms, very small. Their sphere of influence is a tiny fraction of the galaxy. They have no real capacity to affect the Emperor's return one way or another. But they might attempt contact. The Tau have previously engaged in diplomatic overtures to the Imperium, with results ranging from brief, cold peace to outright war, depending on circumstances. A returned emperor who is genuinely trying to rebuild the Imperium along the rational, secular lines of his original vision might be more receptive to the idea of the Tau than the existing Imperium has been. Not as allies, necessarily, but as a civilization worth understanding rather than simply exterminating. Whether that opening would ever lead anywhere is deeply uncertain, but the returned emperor would at least be capable of entertaining the idea in a way that the current Imperium's institutional structures make virtually impossible. The Tyranids are, in strategic terms, the most straightforward of the alien powers to understand and the most terrifying to contemplate. They are the great hunger of the galaxy, an extragalactic threat that has been consuming world after world since the first hive fleets arrived in the Milky Way. They have no interest in diplomacy, no interest in understanding, no interest in anything except biomass. They are not evil in the way the Chaos Gods are evil. They simply eat. They have been eating their way across the galaxy for a long time, and the projections of what happens if nothing stops them are not encouraging. The Tyranids' relationship to the warp is unusual. They suppress it rather than utilizing it. The shadow in the warp, the psychic interference field generated by a Tyranid hive fleet, disrupts psychic communication and makes warp travel extremely difficult within the fleet's operational area. In a galaxy increasingly dominated by warp instability, this actually makes Tyranid-controlled space paradoxically more navigable in certain respects than the surrounding regions. The Emperor, thinking strategically, would recognize the Tyranids as the threat that does not respond to any of the tools that can be brought to bear against chaos. No psychic pressure, no appeals to reason or emotion, no military deterrence in the conventional sense, just the need to destroy enough of them, quickly enough, that the consumption of the galaxy becomes geometrically impossible. The Tyranids, in the very long view, may be the reason the Emperor chose to preserve himself on the Golden Throne rather than trying to die and be reborn sooner. Not the Chaos Gods, the Tyranids, because the Chaos Gods, terrible as they are internal to the galaxy. They are made of the galaxy's own energy. They cannot consume the galaxy entirely, because doing so would destroy the emotional substrate they require for their own existence. But the Tyranids are an external threat, with no such constraint. They can eat everything, and stopping them requires a humanity strong enough to fight on a scale, and for a duration that no single generation can manage alone. Section 10. The Emperor and the Warp, can the wound be healed? The Great Rift, the Cicatrix Maledictum, is the most dramatic manifestation of the galaxy's psychic crisis. When Cadia fell and its network of Necron-constructed pylons was destroyed, the barrier between the warp and real space that had been held in place for 65 million years finally collapsed across a vast swath of the galaxy. The result is a wound that stretches from the Eye of Terror in the galactic northwest to the Hadex anomaly in the galactic east, dividing the Imperium in half, disrupting warp travel, intensifying psychic phenomena across the entire galaxy, and providing the forces of chaos with direct access to real space in ways that were previously much more limited. The question of whether the Emperor, returned to full power, could close the Great Rift is one of the most significant questions in this entire scenario. And the answer is deeply uncertain. Even if we assume his power is everything, the most optimistic interpretations of his nature would suggest. The Great Rift is not simply a psychic problem, even though it manifests as one. Its creation involved the physical destruction of Cadia and its pylons, the enormous release of energy from the partial awakening of Yin-Yad, the accumulated weight of 10,000 years of chaos worship and daemonic activity, and the deliberate, multi-millennium strategy of Abaddon the Despoiler. Closing it would require more than raw psychic force. It would require the equivalent of pylons on a massive scale, physical structures capable of reinforcing the barrier between real space and the warp across the rift's entire length. This is, interestingly, where the parallel between the Emperor's agenda and the Silent King's project becomes most relevant. The Necrons already understand pylon technology. They built Cadia's pylons. They are currently trying to build a network of similar structures in the Pariah Nexus, though for their own reasons, and using their own methods that have their own terrible costs. The possibility of a collaboration between the Emperor and the Silent King to build a new generation of pylons that could stabilize the Great Rift without the soul-destroying effects of the Pariah Nexus is genuinely exciting. Two beings with the deepest possible understanding of both the problem and the available technical solutions, working from opposite sides of the psychic spectrum to find an answer. But even if the pylons could be built, even if the rift could be narrowed or partially closed, the underlying conditions that allowed it to open in the first place would still exist. The Chaos Gods would still be there, still powerful, still feeding on the emotions of every simian in the galaxy. The deep corruption of human civilization that allows chaos to find purchase everywhere, in the corruption of governors, and the despair of factory workers, and the cruelty of inquisitors, all of that would still be present. Closing the rift would be treating a symptom, not a cause. The cause is, and has always been, the relationship between sentient life and the warp. The warp reflects emotion. The Chaos Gods are made of emotion taken to its most extreme and terrible forms. The solution, in the Emperor's long view, is not to seal the warp off from the material universe, which would require destroying the psychic potential of every sentient being, and is essentially impossible anyway. The solution is to change the character of what flows into the warp from the material universe. Less rage, less despair, less desperate ambition, and obsessive excess. More of the things that fed the Emperor's own evolution in the warp: hope, love, devotion, the willingness to sacrifice for something greater than yourself. This is an extraordinarily difficult thing to engineer in a galaxy at war. When people are fighting for their survival every day, when the darkness is literally pressing in through the walls, the emotional profile of civilized life tends toward exactly the wrong things. The Emperor's project during the Great Crusade was always partly about this, about creating the conditions under which humanity could develop in ways that would gradually shift the psychic balance of the warp. The Horus Heresy ended that project before it had time to do its work. A second attempt, conducted by a being shaped by 10,000 years of exposure to the consequences of the first failure, would be different. The Emperor would know that idealistic intellectual arguments about the importance of rationalism are not sufficient. He would know that institutions need to be built carefully, that human psychology needs to be understood rather than overridden, that the long game requires accepting short-term imperfection in service of long-term improvement. The wound in the galaxy is real, and it is deep. It may not be possible to fully close it within any time frame meaningful to ordinary human life, but it might be possible to stop it from getting worse, to stabilize it, to prevent the Chaos Gods from using it to pour their forces into the galaxy at will, to buy humanity the time it needs to do the harder work of changing itself. That is not the heroic narrative of the Emperor riding into battle and smiting the darkness with a single blow. It is something more patient and more difficult and, in the end, more meaningful. Section 11. What kind of Imperium does he build? This is the question that separates the people who think the Emperor's return would simply be the heroic resolution of every problem from the people who think about it more carefully and realize that the return is the beginning of a new and different kind of crisis, not the end of the old one. The Emperor, returning to an Imperium that has spent 10,000 years institutionalizing everything he opposed, would face a choice that has no good options, only less bad ones. Tear down what exists and build something better, at enormous cost in blood and time, and the disruption of every system that ordinary people depend on for their survival. Or work within what exists, using its existing structures as scaffolding while gradually reforming them from within, accepting that progress will be slower and less complete than he would like. Guilliman, facing a smaller version of this same dilemma, has largely chosen the second path. He is reforming the Imperium from within, pushing changes through the High Lords, funding projects like Belisarius Cawl's Primaris Marine program, trying to modernize and rationalize where he can, without causing the kind of schism that would do more damage than the problems he is trying to fix. He has had limited success, and he knows it. The Imperium is too big, too complex, and too invested in its own dysfunction to reform quickly or easily. The Emperor, with his different relationship to the institutional structures of the Imperium, might take a more direct approach. He is not constrained by the political need to maintain consensus. He is the Emperor. He can simply declare things changed and expect them to change. He can dismantle the High Lords of Terra as a governing body and replace them with something more functional. He can revoke the ecclesiarchy's state status and begin the process of separating the Church from the state of the Imperium. He can issue an imperial decree authorizing and requiring the development and application of new technology, stripping the Adeptus Mechanicus of their stranglehold on innovation. Each of these actions would be simple to declare and enormously difficult to implement. The High Lords would resist replacement. The ecclesiarchy has the support of billions of deeply sincere believers who would see its dissolution as an attack on their faith. The Adeptus Mechanicus controls the production and maintenance of the Imperium's entire technological base. You cannot simply fire them. Without them, the entire military and industrial infrastructure of the Imperium stops functioning within weeks. What the Emperor would need, more than raw authority, is time and patience, and the willingness to accept that the Imperium he builds will not be the Imperium he originally envisioned. That 10,000 years of history cannot be undone in a generation. That the humans who inhabit the 42nd millennium are not the same humans who lived during the Great Crusade, and the Imperium that works for them needs to be built for who they are, not who he wished they were. There are lore precedents for what a reformed Imperium might look like. Guilliman has already gestured towards some of them. Greater local autonomy for planetary governments, reducing the grinding inefficiency of Terra-based administration for every minor decision. Better integration of Space Marine chapters with local defense networks so that the chapters function more as mobile response forces and less as independently operating armies, with no accountability to the populations they supposedly protect. More rational management of the psyker situation, treating psykers as the essential resource they are, rather than primarily as a threat to be controlled, and developing better training programs that reduce the risk of chaos corruption without requiring the sacrifice of functional individuals. The return of the imperial truth, or something like it, is more complicated. The Emperor cannot simply announce that the God-Emperor cult is dissolved and expect the faith of trillions of people to evaporate. But he can begin the slow, generational work of transforming what that faith means, moving it away from superstition, away from the burning of scholars, away from the persecution of those who ask questions, moving it towards something closer to what the Adepta Sororitas at their best represent, a faith that is genuine and sincere, but directed toward the protection and elevation of humanity rather than its control and exploitation. The Sisters of Battle are, in many ways, one of the most hopeful things about the existing Imperium. They are the military arm of the Church, yes, but they are also deeply and genuinely committed to the protection of the innocent, to the defense of the weak, to the kinds of virtues that any ethical system would endorse. Their faith produces miracles in the lore that are not just plot convenience, but actual genuine reflections of what sincerely directed belief can do in a universe where the warp is real and emotion has substance. The Emperor, returning with 10,000 years of evidence about what kinds of faith actually protect humanity and what kinds merely exploit it, might find in the Sororitas a model for what the revised imperial faith could look like. The long arc of the Emperor's governance, measured in centuries rather than years, would need to point toward the same destination his original crusade was always aimed at, a humanity strong enough, wise enough, and spiritually evolved enough that the Chaos Gods could no longer find easy purchase in the collective psyche of the species. A humanity that could, eventually, stand in the warp not as victims to be consumed, but as equals, as a fifth presence capable of contesting with the four ruinous powers on their own ground. This is not a story that ends in a single generation. It is a story measured in ages. Section 12. The final question is, the Emperor's return a salvation or a new kind of doom? We have spent a long time exploring the mechanics and the politics and the military strategy of what happens when the Emperor wakes up. But there is a deeper question underneath all of that, the one that I want to sit with for a moment before we finish, because it is the question that makes this thought experiment genuinely interesting, rather than just a power fantasy. Is the Emperor's return actually good for humanity? This seems like it should have an obvious answer. Of course it is. The most powerful being humanity has ever produced, restored to the fight, the Astronomicon strengthened, the psychic defenses of Terra secured, the Chaos Gods facing a genuinely terrible adversary on both the physical and psychic battlefield. The Primarchs rallied, the Imperium guided by someone who actually understands what it needs and has the authority to make it happen. But let us think about this from a different angle. The Imperium's dysfunction has not produced a civilization that is on the verge of collapse. It has produced a civilization that has survived for over 10,000 years against threats that should have destroyed it many times over. The grinding horror of the 41st millennium is not simply corruption and failure. It is also resilience, stubbornness, the willingness of ordinary human beings to keep fighting against impossible odds because the alternative is unacceptable. That quality, that refusal to give up, is not nothing. It is perhaps the most important thing humanity has to offer in a galaxy that wants to consume it. The Emperor's return, if handled badly, could actually undermine some of that. If humanity begins to feel that the Emperor is handling things, that the greatest threats are being addressed by the most powerful being in history, there is a risk of complacency, of dependency, of the slow erosion of the self-reliance that has allowed humanity to survive all these centuries of his absence. The Emperor himself understood this to some degree. His original vision for the Imperium was not a civilization dependent on his personal power and attention. It was a civilization that had internalized the values and the capabilities that would allow it to thrive without him. He wanted to build something that would not need him. He sat down on the throne partly because he had to, but also because he knew that a galaxy where every human being looked to him for salvation rather than finding their own strength was a galaxy that would eventually fail. A returned emperor who responds to this understanding would not try to be the galaxy's savior. He would try to be its teacher, its guide, the being that helps humanity evolve, past the need for his direct intervention, rather than the being that handles humanity's problems, so it never has to develop the capacity to handle them itself. This is a more difficult role. It requires a kind of restraint that is alien to the image of the emperor as a warrior god. It requires the acceptance of short-term failure in the service of long-term growth. It requires trusting in humanity in a way that the emperor, who has lived among humans for 50,000 years and watched them make the same mistakes over and over, might find genuinely difficult. But it is also the only version of his return that ends in a good place. Because a galaxy saved by the emperor is still a galaxy that needed saving, and a galaxy that needed the emperor to save it will need him to save it again and again, until the day he is finally and permanently gone, and there is nothing left to hold back the dark. The version of the Emperor's return that offers genuine hope is not the one where he destroys the Chaos Gods in a single titanic battle. It is not the one where he rebuilds the Imperium in his own image and governs it personally for another 10,000 years. It is the one where his return gives humanity the breathing room it needs to become something that genuinely does not require saving, to grow into the species that he always believed it could be. The inheritors of the galaxy, not because they were given the galaxy, but because they became worthy of it. That is a story without a clean ending. It is a story measured in generations, in setbacks and recovery, in small victories that accumulate over long spans of time into something that begins to look like progress. It is a story told not in golden light and thunderous victories, but in the quiet persistence of people who choose to build rather than to destroy, to learn rather than to burn, to hope rather than to despair. In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. That is the tagline. That is the setting's defining statement. But under all that war, in every moment of it, there are also human beings who are not defined by it, who endure it and mourn it and persist despite it, and sometimes, in some small way, find a path through it towards something worth fighting for. The Emperor, if he wakes up, is not the answer to the darkness. He is the possibility of a path through it. Whether humanity finds that path is, in the end, humanity's own business, and that is how it should be. A final thought. We began this conversation in a room deep beneath the Imperial Palace, listening to the sound of machines that should not be necessary, keeping a man alive who should not have survived. We began with the weight of 36 billion lives, burned across 10,000 years to hold back the dark. We began with the question of what happens when the being at the center of all of that finally opens his eyes. And what we have found in exploring that question through every layer of the setting is that the answer is never simple. The Emperor's return would not solve the Imperium's problems. It would transform them, redirect them, give them a new character and a new urgency. It would give humanity, for the first time in 10 millennia, the possibility of fighting its wars with a destination in mind, rather than simply fighting to avoid an ending. The Chaos Gods would rage and scheme. The traitor Primarchs would face a reckoning they have perhaps been dreading and welcoming in equal measure. The ecclesiarchy would find itself on the wrong side of the man whose name it has been speaking in every prayer for 10,000 years. The Necrons would face a force that understands the problem of the warp from the inside out. The galaxy would tremble, and some of that trembling would be terror, and some of it would be something that has been absent from the dark millennium for a very long time. Relief. The Emperor is not a perfect being. He never was. His failures were real, his blind spots were deep, and his absence has cost more than any accounting can fully capture. But he is also, in the truest sense, humanity's own. Born from the accumulated wisdom and sacrifice of the species' ancient dead, shaped by 50,000 years of walking among ordinary people and learning from them, even as he guided them, transformed by 10,000 years of sharing the worst of the galaxy's darkness so that others could walk in a little more light. Whatever he wakes up as, whatever form his return takes, whatever age it ushers in, that is what he carries with him. The accumulated weight of every human life that has ever prayed in his name, every soldier who has died with his image in their mind, every child who has been told in the darkness that the Emperor protects and has chosen to believe it. Whether he deserves that weight is a question the setting never quite answers. Whether he is able to honor it is the question that the rest of the story will spend its time exploring. But that he wakes up carrying it, aware of it, changed by it, that I think is certain. And in the grim darkness of the far future, that might be enough to make a difference. If you made it to the end of this one, thank you, genuinely. This took a long time to put together, and I hope you felt every moment of it was worth it. If you have thoughts about which aspect of the Emperor's Return you find most interesting, or if there is something I have not covered that you think should have been part of this discussion, drop it in the comments below. I read every single one of them. If this kind of deep, immersive dive into the lore is what you are here for, subscribing means you will never miss one. And sharing it with someone who loves this setting as much as you do means this kind of content can keep being made. Until next time, the Emperor protects, or he will, once he wakes up. Section 13. The Astronomicon Reborn Navigating a Changed Galaxy. One of the most immediate and most practically significant consequences of the Emperor's return, which we touched on in the physical resurrection section, but which deserves its own detailed treatment, is what happens to the Astronomicon, because the Astronomicon is not simply a convenience. It is, for all practical purposes, the skeleton of the Imperium, the structure without which the flesh of a trillion-person civilization cannot hold together. Let us be precise about what the Astronomicon currently is. It is a psychic beacon of extraordinary power, broadcast from Terra, generated by the combined output of a large choir of specially trained psychers, whose abilities are focused and amplified by the Emperor's own consciousness. It shines outward from Terra in all directions, a concentrated point of psychic light visible to navigators, who are themselves psychic mutations, capable of perceiving the warp while remaining functional in real space. The beacon tells them where Terra is. It gives them an anchor point, a fixed reference in the shifting, directionless chaos of the immaterium. Without it, a navigator entering the warp with the intention of traveling to a specific location would be attempting to navigate a featureless storm with no landmarks and no compass. Some warp travel is possible without the Astronomicon. Short hops between nearby systems, routes that have been traveled so many times that they have worn ruts in the fabric of the warp that experienced navigators can follow by feel. Ancient Eldar routes through the webway. The exceptional skill of individual navigators who can orient themselves by other psychic landmarks. But the vast majority of Imperial shipping, the enormous logistical network that carries soldiers and food and weapons and materials across the galaxy to maintain the wars that keep the Imperium alive, depends on the Astronomicon. Currently, the Astronomicon's effective range from Terra is approximately 50,000 light-years in optimal conditions. This is an enormous distance, greater than the distance from one side of the Milky Way to the other at the galaxy's widest point. But it is not infinite, and the creation of the Great Rift has complicated this further. On the Imperium Sanctus side, the side that contains Terra, the Astronomicon still shines with sufficient clarity to guide navigation, though the psychic turbulence created by the rift makes even that more difficult than it was before. On the Imperium Nihilus side, the dark side, the rift's interference is severe enough that the Astronomicon is effectively blocked. Navigators in the Dark Imperium are essentially operating without their most important tool, relying on local landmarks and their own extraordinary skill to thread passages through the warp that are genuinely dangerous in ways that Astronomicon-guided routes are not. When the Emperor returns to full physical capacity and frees himself from the constraints of the Golden Throne, the Astronomicon would not simply continue at its current level. His full, direct, unmediated psychic projection would be orders of magnitude more powerful than the current throne-mediated version. The immediate effect would be described by navigators across the galaxy as the difference between navigating by a distant star and navigating by a sun at close range. The beacon would become almost overwhelmingly bright to psychic senses, requiring navigators to adjust their perceptual filters in ways they had never needed to before. More importantly, the penetrating power of the beacon would increase dramatically. The Great Rift, which currently blocks the Astronomicon from reaching the Imperium Nihilus, might not be fully transparent to even the Emperor's fully empowered projection. The rift is a genuine tear in the fabric of reality, and even the most powerful psychic signal can only penetrate it with difficulty. but it might be penetrable, at least partially, at least enough to give navigators in the Dark Imperium something to work with. A faint light is better than no light when you are trying to navigate a storm. The transformation of the Astronomicon would also have implications for the 1,000 Psykers who currently sacrifice their lives daily to maintain it. The Emperor, no longer constrained by the throne's mediation, would not need them in the same way. Their deaths, which have been the foundation of the Imperium's logistical capability for 10,000 years, would become unnecessary. This creates both a practical opportunity, 36,000 people per year who do not have to die, and a theological crisis for an institution that has built considerable ritual and meaning around the sacrifice. The Black Ships, the soul-binding ceremonies, the entire apparatus of Psyker management built around the assumption that Psykers are ultimately resources to be consumed rather than people to be trained and integrated, would need to be entirely rethought. The longer-term implication is more profound still. With the Emperor fully active rather than throne-bound, and with the Astronomicon transformed into a more powerful and more direct projection, the conditions for genuine webway access improve dramatically. Remember that the Golden Throne was originally designed as a webway portal, and that the Emperor's original plan was always to give humanity access to the webway as a replacement for warp travel entirely. That plan was destroyed by Magnus's breach, which opened a warp portal that has required the Emperor's constant attention ever since to prevent demonic incursion. If the Emperor can seal that breach permanently, through the application of his full recovered power rather than the endless holding action of the past 10,000 years, the Golden Throne becomes available for its original purpose again. Or something built on its principles, repaired and enhanced by 10,000 years of accumulated Mechanicus knowledge about how it works, could be. The webway route to every part of the galaxy, safe from warp instability, safe from demonic intrusion, available to humanity for the first time, would transform the strategic situation of the Imperium as completely as the Astronomicon's restoration. Perhaps more completely, because webway travel is not just safer than warp travel, it is instant. The logistics of governing an empire that spans a galaxy become dramatically more manageable when communication and troop movements no longer require weeks or months of warp transit. The transformation of the Imperium's transportation infrastructure would, in the long run, do more for humanity's survival than any military victory. Supply lines that work reliably, communication that reaches the front without months of delay, the ability to concentrate forces in response to crises before those crises have already become disasters. All of these things have been preventing the Imperium from functioning as a coherent civilization for 10,000 years, and all of them improve dramatically if the warp transit problem is addressed and the webway becomes accessible. This is the kind of reform that does not make for dramatic stories of heroic battle, but which determines whether civilizations survive. The Emperor, who has always been as much a builder as a warrior, would understand this, and the restoration of transportation infrastructure would be among his highest practical priorities from the first days of his return. Section 14. The Long War transformed what the traitor legions do. The 9 traitor legions that fled into the Eye of Terror after the Horus Heresy have been conducting what they call the Long War for 10,000 years. They have never stopped fighting the Imperium. They have never stopped believing, with varying degrees of sincerity depending on the individual and the legion, that the Emperor was wrong and that their rebellion was justified. They have been sustained in this belief by the certainty that the Emperor is dying, that his power is failing, that the death of his golden prison is only a matter of time, and that when it comes, their revenge and their triumph will be complete. The Emperor's return shatters that certainty completely. The psychological impact on the traitor legions of discovering that their greatest enemy has not only survived but recovered and walked out of the throne would be extraordinary and varied. For some, it would be devastating. For others, it might be galvanizing in ways that make them more dangerous rather than less. Consider the Iron Warriors, Perturabo's Legion. They have spent 10,000 years conducting sieges and engineering campaigns against the Imperium with mechanical, joyless thoroughness. They hate the Emperor, but they hate more the sense that their war has no end, that they are fighting a campaign of attrition that grinds on forever without resolution. The Emperor's return brings the possibility of an end, even if that end is the worst possible outcome from the Iron Warrior's perspective. There is something to fight toward, even if that something is an apocalyptic final battle. Some of them might find that energizing. A final battle against a fully returned emperor is the kind of conflict that, even in defeat, has weight and meaning. The word-bearers, Lorgar's Legion, face the most theologically complex situation. They are the ones who started the religion of chaos, who turned the worship of the emperor into the worship of the ruinous powers. They are, in their own minds, true believers in the real gods of the universe, the beings who actually answer prayers, who actually grant power in exchange for devotion. The emperor's return is, for a word-bearer, not simply a military threat, it is a theological crisis. Because here is a being who was worshipped as a god for 10,000 years, and who now walks again, and the question of whether that walking constitutes evidence for or against the emperor's divinity would split the Legion in ways that might be more destructive to it than any military campaign. The Alpha Legion, always the most inscrutable of the legions, might react in a way that surprises everyone, including themselves. The Alpha Legion's relationship to chaos has always been ambiguous. They serve chaos undivided, but they have never been entirely clear about whether they serve it because they believe in it, or because serving it is tactically useful for achieving goals that may or may not align with chaos's actual interests. The theory that the Alpha Legion has always been working toward ends that they themselves only partially understand. That Alfarius and Omegon agreed to something in their deal with the Cabal has never been resolved in the lore. The Emperor's return might be the moment that clarifies what the Alpha Legion has actually been doing all this time. The Night Lords, Conrad Kurz's Legion, are arguably the most tragic of the traitor legions, because their Primarch was the most tragic of the traitor Primarchs. Kurz was a precognitive, someone who could see the future, and what he saw of it broke him long before the heresy began. He turned his legion into a force of terror, not because he believed in terror, but because he believed nothing else worked. That fear was the only reliable tool for preventing worse violence, that humanity was irredeemably violent, and the only honest response to that was violence directed strategically. The Emperor's return, and the possibility of an Imperium that actually works towards something better, would cut to the heart of everything the Night Lords have been telling themselves for 10,000 years. Whether any of them can hear that message is uncertain. Whether any of them would want to is more uncertain still. The traitor legion's response to the Emperor's return would not be unified. The Chaos Gods would want them to attack immediately, to throw everything at the most significant threat in 10,000 years. But the legions have their own leaders, their own agendas, their own complicated internal politics. Some would attack, others would wait. A few might do something genuinely unexpected. And the Daemon Primarchs, each of them carrying the weight of 10,000 years of their own decisions, would each make their own choice about how to respond to their father's return. Section 15. The Emperor's first words. What does he say? This is, in some ways, the simplest question in the entire scenario, and in other ways, the most profound. The Emperor of mankind has not spoken in 10,000 years. Civilization rose and fell, and was maintained and corrupted, and fought over in his name for 10,000 years. And now he is standing, and the room is quiet, and the custodians are waiting, and the question of what he says first is the question that sets the tone for everything that follows. He would not make a speech. Not immediately. The Emperor, whatever else he was not a being who spoke for effect. He spoke when he had something to say, and when he believed the person he was speaking to was capable of receiving it. The first words would be direct and practical, probably addressed to the most senior custodian present, and they would begin the process of understanding exactly where things stand. He would want to know the date, not because he does not already have a rough sense of how much time has passed, but because fixing the exact moment in time is the first step in building an accurate picture of the current situation. He would want a full briefing on everything that has changed since he last had clear, direct knowledge of the material world. He would want to know where Guilliman is. He would want to know the current state of the Great Rift. He would want to know what the Adeptus Mechanicus's most recent assessment of the Golden Throne's condition was, and whether those conditions have changed now that he is free of it. And somewhere in the middle of those practical requests, he would say something to the custodian standing before him that has nothing to do with strategy or assessment, something personal. Because the custodians have been standing vigil over a silent, immobile figure for 10,000 years, and the first of them, to stand before their returned master, would be carrying 10,000 years of his own grief and service. The Emperor would see that. He would acknowledge it. What he says to Guilliman, when they finally stand face to face, would be different again. Guilliman has been working in the Emperor's name for 10,000 years, first in the immediate aftermath of the heresy, and then again in the current era after his own resurrection. He has made decisions the Emperor might not have made. He has said things about the Emperor that came from a place of deep love and deep frustration in equal measure. The conversation between the returned Emperor and the avenging son would be one of the most emotionally loaded exchanges in the history of the setting, and it would set the terms for their working relationship going forward. The speech to the Imperium, when it finally comes, would be unlike anything humanity has heard in 10,000 years. Not because it would be inspiring in the conventional rhetorical sense, though the Emperor's capacity for rhetoric is extraordinary, but because it would be honest in a way that the Imperium is not accustomed to. It would not promise victory. It would not claim that all problems are now solved. It would not invoke divine protection or the certainty of ultimate triumph. It would say what the situation actually is and what needs to be done and why, and it would ask humanity to be capable of hearing the truth and rising to meet it. It would treat humanity as adults rather than subjects, as people capable of making real choices rather than being managed into correct behavior by a combination of faith and fear. Some people would find this deeply unsettling. The entire psychological structure of the Imperium is built on the comfort of being told what to believe and what to do and what to fear. The Emperor standing in front of them and saying, essentially, the future depends on your choices, and here are the real stakes, and I believe you are capable of making the right ones, would be destabilizing in a way that no military campaign could be. But it would also be the first genuinely honest thing the Imperium had heard in 10,000 years. And there is a hunger for honesty in human beings that persists even when it has been suppressed for a very long time, that rises when given the opportunity in ways that can be extraordinary and transformative. The Emperor's first words would begin the long, slow, necessary work of giving humanity back the one thing that 10,000 years of the existing Imperium had taken from it most thoroughly, the belief that it was capable of managing its own future. Closing meditation. The Emperor as mirror. There is something worth sitting with as we reach the end of this journey through the implications of the Emperor's waking. Something that is not about strategy or military power or political reform, but about what the Emperor represents at the deepest level of the setting. Warhammer 40,000 has always been, at its core, a meditation on the gap between what human civilization aspires to be and what it actually is. The Imperium is meant to be the protector of humanity, and it is. It is also the greatest oppressor humanity has ever experienced. The Emperor is meant to be the champion of rationality and human potential, and he is. He is also the figure whose absence enabled the most irrational, most potential-crushing institution in the setting to grow unchecked for 10,000 years. The Space Marines are meant to be humanity's finest warriors, and they are. They are also, in many cases, isolated, fanatical instruments of a terrible machine that cares nothing for the people they were created to protect. The gap between aspiration and reality is not a flaw in the setting. It is the setting. It is what makes it interesting, and what gives it the capacity to say things about real human civilization that straightforward heroic science fiction cannot say. The Imperium is not a warning about alien civilizations or fictional future politics. It is a warning about tendencies that exist in all human institutions, in all human organizations, in all human attempts to do good at scale over time. The tendency for the means to become ends in themselves. The tendency for protective institutions to become things that primarily protect themselves. The tendency for necessary violence to become normalized and then celebrated. The tendency for ignorance to become a virtue when knowledge threatens established power. The Emperor's return does not fix any of these tendencies. They are not things that can be fixed by any single being, however powerful. They are aspects of human nature that require generations of careful attention to manage. What the Emperor's return does is provide something that the existing Imperium does not have: a genuine standard against which reality can be measured, a clear statement of what the intention was and what the result should be. A figure who, when the ecclesiarch says this is the emperor's will, can respond directly and specifically that no, this is not my will, and here is what my will actually is. This is not comfortable for anyone. It is not comfortable for the ecclesiarch. It is not comfortable for the inquisitors who have been operating under their own interpretation of the emperor's will for decades. It is not even comfortable for the people who have been praying sincerely to the God Emperor all their lives, and who now must contend with the fact that the being they have been praying to is a complicated, flawed, extraordinary human being rather than the omniscient, compassionate divine figure of popular faith. But discomfort in the service of truth is exactly the kind of experience that the Emperor's Great Crusade was supposed to provide to the galaxy, and that the 10,000 years of the Imperium in its current form has systematically denied to the trillions of human beings who deserved it. The Emperor waking up is not the end of the story. It is the beginning of the honest version of the story, the one where the gap between aspiration and reality is named, examined, and committed to, carefully and patiently, closing. And in the grim darkness of the far future, that is perhaps the most radical thing of all. If you are still here, if you have made it through this entire exploration, from the first mention of that room beneath the Imperial Palace to this final thought about what the Emperor represents at the level of meaning rather than mechanics, then you are exactly the kind of person this channel exists for. Leave your thoughts in the comments. Tell me where you are watching from and what time it is there. Tell me which part of this sparked something for you, whether it was the question of what the Emperor's first words would be, or the confrontation with Angron, or the diplomatic encounter with the Silent King, or something else entirely. Tell me if you think his return would be salvation or a new and different kind of catastrophe. And subscribe if you have not yet, because this is what we do here, and there is a great deal more of it to come. Expanded reflection, the perpetual and the long view of history. To fully understand what the Emperor's return means, we need to spend more time thinking about what it means to be a perpetual and what 10,000 years of perpetual existence on the Golden Throne has actually done to his perception of time, of humanity, and of the stakes involved in this moment. A perpetual is, in essence, a human being who cannot die permanently. They are killed, and then they return, and they carry with them the memories of everything that happened before. For an ordinary perpetual, this process happens over the course of years or decades, and each death and rebirth is a discrete event with clear before and after moments. The Emperor is not an ordinary perpetual. He is the oldest and most powerful perpetual ever born, carrying within him the accumulated experience of roughly 48,000 years of living and dying and learning and growing, and watching the world change around him in ways that no finite lifespan can encompass. Think about what it means to have watched history happen from the inside for 48,000 years. The Emperor was alive during the Neolithic period of human development. He watched the first cities rise. He watched the first empires fall. He watched the discovery of iron, of bronze, of gunpowder, of electricity, of nuclear power, of faster-than-light travel. He watched civilizations that seemed invincible crumble to dust and be replaced by new civilizations that seemed equally invincible and crumbled in their turn. He was present at the birth of every major philosophical tradition in human history. He was present, in various guises, at moments that shaped the trajectory of human development in ways that are still felt 48,000 years later. This perspective gives him something that no other being in the setting possesses: a genuine, lived understanding of how long human change actually takes. Not the theoretical understanding of a historian looking back at records, but the gut level, embodied knowledge of someone who watched the shift from hunter-gatherer societies to agricultural civilization happen in real time, who waded through what must have seemed like geological ages for changes that, in retrospect, happened quickly. Who learned, over the course of tens of thousands of years of observation and participation, that the most significant changes in human civilization are rarely the ones that happen suddenly and dramatically. They are the ones that happen slowly and persistently. The gradual accumulation of small shifts in how people think and feel and organize themselves, until one day you look up and realize that the world is fundamentally different from what it was. The Emperor's patience, when it is properly understood, is not the patience of someone who is simply waiting for things to work out. It is the patience of someone who has seen, from the inside, how long it actually takes for the kind of deep change he is trying to achieve to manifest. The Great Crusade was not patient enough. It moved too fast for the cultural transformations it was trying to implement to take root properly. The imperial truth was decreed, and then the legions moved on to the next world, leaving behind populations that had been told what to believe, but had not been given the time or the tools to actually build the internal structures that would make those beliefs sustainable. When the heresy came and the emperor was no longer present to reinforce those structures by his personal authority, they collapsed almost immediately. A second attempt, informed by this understanding, would be different in its pacing. The emperor would know that the work of changing how humanity thinks and feels about itself and its place in the galaxy is measured not in years, but in generations. That the children of the people who first received the reformed vision of what the Imperium should be will be more shaped by it than their parents. That their children will be more shaped by it still. That the real transformation happens at the level of culture and values, which is the slowest moving thing in human civilization and also the most persistent. He would also know, from his 48,000 years of watching history, that the most resilient civilizations are not the ones built on the authority of a single extraordinary figure, however powerful. The empires built around a single great person tend to outlast that person by only a few generations before the coherence provided by that person's presence dissipates and the underlying structures fail. He made this mistake once, building the Imperium around his own authority in a way that left it catastrophically vulnerable to his absence. A second attempt would be built differently, with the Emperor's presence as a catalyst for change, rather than the change itself, with the goal being the creation of institutions and values and capabilities that can sustain themselves. This understanding shapes every aspect of how the Emperor would approach his return. He is not trying to fix everything immediately. He is trying to create the conditions under which things can begin to be fixed, and then trusting that the process, properly started and properly maintained, will continue without him needing to personally supervise every step of it. He is planting seeds rather than harvesting crops, and the harvest is something he might not personally see, but something he is creating the possibility of seeing for those who come after. The Space Marines, in a New Age children of the Emperor, returned. The Space Marines of the 41st millennium are, in many ways, the Emperor's greatest success and his most complex legacy. They are the pinnacle of his genetic engineering work, the fulfillment of his vision for the Astartes program, refined over the course of the Great Crusade, and then reshaped by Guilliman's Codex into the chapter structure that has defined them for 10,000 years. They are also beings of extraordinary complexity, carrying within them the genetic inheritance of their Primarchs, and through those Primarchs, the Emperor's own nature, shaped into thousands of slightly different expressions of the same fundamental concept. The Emperor's return would transform the relationship between him and the Space Marines in profound ways. For 10,000 years, the chapters have operated with an understanding that their creator is present but incapable of direct communication, that his will is expressed through the Codex Astartes, and through the traditions of their chapter, and through the interpretations of the chaplains, who serve as the spiritual guides of each chapter's culture. This has created a relationship with the Emperor that is theological in nature, a relationship with an absent divinity whose guidance comes through scripture and tradition rather than in direct communication. Now the absent divinity is present, and the question of what the Emperor actually thinks of what the Space Marines have become, what he thinks of their traditions and their interpretations and their 10,000 years of development in his absence, is no longer theoretical. He can answer it directly. Some chapters would find this deeply affirming. The Black Templars, perhaps the most overtly devout of all the chapters, who have conducted a perpetual crusade in the Emperor's name since the end of the heresy, would find in his return the validation of everything they have devoted their existence to. Their faith, which has always been the most explicit and the most fervent in the Space Marine community, would be rewarded by direct confirmation that the object of that faith is real and present and aware of them. Other chapters would find it more complicated. The Space Wolves, who have always maintained that their bond with the Emperor predates and transcends any formal religious framework, who have held to a distinctly non-codex organization and have resisted every attempt to make them conform to the standard chapter structure, would need to have a conversation with their returned father about the nature of their independence. The Emperor, who created the legions as instruments of a unified crusade, might have complex feelings about an age in which his former legion has become a collection of fraternal, deeply autonomous warrior clans who acknowledge his authority primarily as an abstract concept. The Primaris Marines, created by Belisarius Cawl under Guilliman's authorization, would be a fascinating point of discussion. Cawl improved on the Emperor's original Astartes template in ways that the Emperor himself had always known were possible but had chosen not to implement, for reasons that the lore implies had something to do with the political sensitivity of creating more powerful Space Marines during the time of the Great Crusade. A returned Emperor, examining Call's work, would be evaluating it not just as a military advancement, but as a statement about the direction the Astartes program should take going forward. His assessment of whether Cawl got it right, whether the improvements are the right improvements, whether there are better improvements to make, would shape the future of the Space Marines as profoundly as anything since the Codex Astartes. The Grey Knights present their own unique situation. They are the Inquisition's chamber militant, the secret force created from some of the best genetic material the legions could produce, built specifically to fight daemons. They are among the most powerful Space Marines in existence, and their entire organizational structure and operational doctrine has been built around the assumption of the Emperor's psychic support being available to them as a resource. Their connection to the Emperor, through their training and their soul binding, gives them capabilities that other chapters lack. When the Emperor returns, the Grey Knight's relationship to him changes from a matter of faith to a matter of direct collaboration, and the implications of that for how they operate and what they are capable of are significant. The 10 to 1,000 years of chapter culture, chapter traditions, chapter beliefs are not going to be simply overwritten by the Emperor's return. Too much has been built, too much has been invested, too much is genuine and sincere and worth preserving. But they would be placed in a new context, understood in relation to a living creator who can confirm what was right and gently correct what was wrong, and explain the reasons for things that had been maintained as tradition, without anyone being certain of the original rationale. This is, in microcosm, what the Emperor's return does for the entire Imperium. Not replacement, but context. Not destruction, but clarification. The slow, patient work of aligning what exists with what was intended, and the even slower, more patient work of building from that alignment towards something that does not yet exist, but that can be imagined now, in ways it could not be imagined before. The fate of Terra, the heart of the Imperium, transformed. Terra, old Earth, the cradle of humanity, has been the capital of the Imperium since its founding, and it has been shaped by 10,000 years of that role into something that bears very little resemblance to the planet it once was. Its entire surface, with the exception of the Antarctic region, is covered in the vast architectural infrastructure of the Imperial government, the Imperial Palace covering a significant fraction of what was once the Himalayan mountain range, the Ecclesiarchal Palace sprawling across what was once the continent of Australia, the hive structures of the former cities buried under and replaced by the machinery of galactic administration. The population of Terra is enormous, billions of people packed into every available space, most of them in the most desperate poverty. The gap between the functionaries who run the greatest empire in history and the menials who maintain the buildings they work in being perhaps the starkest illustration of the Imperium's fundamental dysfunction. The air is recycled through enormous systems because the atmosphere of the planet itself is no longer capable of supporting human life without technological intervention. The oceans that once covered much of the surface have been partially drained and their beds converted into additional habitable space. The sky above Terra is frequently invisible behind the industrial haze and the contrails of the thousands of ships moving through the system every day. And yet Terra is still, somehow, recognizably Earth. There are places beneath the mountains of the Imperial Palace where someone who knew where to look could find traces of what came before. Structural echoes of ancient buildings incorporated into the foundations of newer construction, geological formations that survive because they were incorporated into load-bearing elements rather than excavated away. Even in the deepest and most restricted sections of the Imperial archives, records that date back to the age when Terra was a normal inhabited world rather than the capital of a galactic empire. The Emperor, returning to Terra, would see all of this with eyes that remember what it was. He has walked on the surface of this planet before it had a name that history would remember. He has watched it change through every age of its existence, from the Neolithic settlements along river valleys, to the sprawling cities of the pre-age of strife, to the techno-barbarism that followed, to the unification wars that he personally conducted, to the construction of the Imperial Palace that buried the Himalayan peaks under tons of adamantium and prayer. He knows every layer of it, and he knows what it has been and what it has become. What he would do with it, what he would want it to become, is a question with both practical and symbolic dimensions. Practically, Terra needs fundamental infrastructure improvements. The life support systems that maintain the atmosphere are aging. The water recycling systems are operating at a fraction of their design capacity. The food production networks that feed billions of people are perpetually on the edge of breakdown. These are not glamorous problems, but they are urgent ones, and an emperor who is serious about the welfare of the humans who inhabit his homeworld would address them. Symbolically, Terra needs to become something different from what it currently is. Currently, it is the center of the largest bureaucracy in the history of the galaxy, a place where the decision-making machinery of the Imperium grinds out orders that take years to implement and decades to evaluate for effectiveness. The Emperor's vision for Terra in the original Imperial design was that it should be the heart of a living civilization, a place of culture and learning and genuine governance rather than simply a place of administration. That vision was never fully realized, and then the heresy and its aftermath made it impossible to pursue for 10,000 years. But the possibility of returning to something closer to that vision, of making Terra a place that represents the best of what the Imperium could be, rather than simply the most powerful version of what it has become, is one of the more inspiring prospects of the Emperor's return. There is a specific physical consequence of the Emperor's return that would transform Terra in ways that would be immediately visible: the opening of the webway portal beneath the Imperial Palace. As we discussed earlier, if the Emperor can permanently seal the demonic breach that Magnus created, the Golden Throne becomes available for its original purpose. And if the webway portal can be opened and made functional, then Terra, for the first time in 10,000 years, would have direct access to the most comprehensive transportation network in the galaxy. Every Eldar craft world that maintains a connection to the webway, every Harlequin node that leads to the Black Library, every ancient passage that winds through the subdimensional tunnels of the galaxy would be accessible from the heart of the Imperium. The strategic implications of this alone are almost impossible to overstate. But the human implications, the meaning of it for the ordinary citizens of Terra, who have lived their entire lives in the shadow of the most important machine in the galaxy, without ever being able to touch it, would be just as significant in their own way. The Golden Throne, the symbol of the Emperor's suffering and the Imperium's dependency and the terrible price of their survival, would be transformed from a prison into something else. Not a symbol of sacrifice and death, but a symbol of possibility and connection. The transition from one to the other would not be instant, and the psychological work of reinterpreting 10,000 years of cultural meaning around the throne would take generations. But it would begin the moment the Emperor stepped off it. The question of faith and what comes after the Church. We have talked about the ecclesiarchy and what the Emperor's return means for the institutional structure of the Imperial Church. But there is a deeper question underneath the institutional one, a question about what faith itself means in a universe where the object of that faith has returned and can be asked directly what he wants. The Imperial cult, as it currently exists, is built on several interlocking theological propositions: that the Emperor is divine, that he sacrificed himself for humanity's salvation, that worship of him provides genuine protection from the darkness, that his will is expressed through the Church and its scriptures and its leadership. Some of these propositions are more true than others, and the returned Emperor's presence would immediately and unavoidably force a reckoning with each of them. The Emperor's divinity is the most complicated. He was never a god in the traditional sense of a being who exists outside the material universe and acts within it through miraculous intervention. He is a psychic entity of extraordinary power who exists within the material universe and whose abilities are so far beyond ordinary human comprehension that the distinction between divinity and extraordinary ability is, from a practical standpoint, minimal. But the metaphysical distinction matters, because it determines what kind of relationship is possible between the Emperor and ordinary human beings. A god, in the traditional sense, is an entity that humans relate to through worship, through submission, through the surrender of their own judgment to a higher authority. An extremely powerful psychic entity who loves humanity and has been fighting for its survival for 50,000 years is an entity that humans could relate to through something more like partnership, more like respect, more like the relationship between a teacher and a student who has grown into something worthy of genuine engagement. The Emperor would want the second kind of relationship. He always wanted it. His rejection of the Imperial cult during the Great Crusade was not primarily about the theological incorrectness of divine claims. It was about the psychological dependency that worship creates, the way it positions the worshipper as passive and the worshipped as responsible for all outcomes, the way it prevents the development of the kind of self-reliance that he knew humanity needed to survive in the long run. But the sincerity of the faith that is developed in his name is not something to be dismissed or mocked. The billions of people who pray to the Emperor every day are not weak or foolish for doing so. They are doing something genuinely meaningful in a psychic universe, where genuinely meaningful things have weight. The question is not whether their faith should exist, but what it should be doing, what it should be oriented toward, what it should produce in the people who hold it. A faith that produces courage and sacrifice, and the willingness to stand between the innocent and the darkness, is valuable. A faith that produces persecution of the different and the burning of the curious is destructive. The Emperor's work, in relation to the Imperial faith, would be the slow, careful transformation of the former into more of the former and less of the latter. Not by decree, because you cannot decree what people feel in their hearts, but by example, by the gradual emergence of a different kind of imperial spirituality that is shaped by what the Emperor actually says and actually does, rather than by what institutions claim he means. The saints of the imperial faith present an interesting case in this regard. The living saints, beings like Saint Celestine, who are clearly genuine manifestations of psychic power, channeled through sincere devotion, would in the Emperor's new Imperium be understood not as miraculous exceptions to natural law, but as examples of what human psychic potential looks like when properly directed and properly supported. The capacity for a human being to become a living saint would be recognized as a spectrum of psychic capability that exists in many people, not just the extraordinarily exceptional, and the conditions that make sainthood possible, that extreme of sincere faith and willingness to serve, could be understood as something that the Imperium should be cultivating in everyone rather than treating as miracles that happen to special individuals through mysterious divine selection. The Sisters of Battle, as the institutional expression of the most sincere and most practically effective version of the Imperial faith, would probably come out of the transition to the new order better than most ecclesiarchal organizations. Their devotion is genuine, their capabilities are real, their commitment to the protection of the innocent and the defense of the faithful represents exactly the kind of faith in action that the Emperor would want to see more of. The order militant might survive the transition relatively intact, even as the broader ecclesiarchy is reformed, because what the sororitas do is less about institutional power and more about the genuine expression of values in action. The great reformers of the Imperium's history, the figures like Sebastian Thor, who transformed the ecclesiarchy after the Reign of Blood, operated within the framework of the existing faith rather than against it, finding within that faith the resources for its own correction. The Emperor, returning, would be doing something similar, but at a far greater scale and with far greater authority. He would not be abolishing faith. He would be inviting it to become something worthy of the name, the weight of victory, what it costs to save the galaxy. There is a question that runs quietly underneath everything we have discussed today, one that is easy to overlook in the excitement of the scenario, but which deserves to be named directly. What does it cost the Emperor personally to do all of this? He has been fighting for 10,000 years in the warp, not metaphorically, not in a passive way, but actively, continuously, with every resource he has, against enemies of extraordinary power on their own ground. He has been doing this while simultaneously sustaining the Astronomicon, soul-binding psychers, and maintaining the wards against the demonic incursion beneath the palace. He has been doing this while his physical body decays to the point where it is barely capable of supporting consciousness, while 36 billion people have died to keep him breathing. He has done all of this without complaint, without retreat, without pause. That kind of sustained effort, even for a being of his extraordinary capability, leaves marks. The Emperor who returns from the throne is not simply a restored version of the Emperor who sat down on it. He is a being who has paid an enormous price for 10,000 years, and who carries that price in ways that are probably not fully visible even to himself. There will be damage that does not manifest immediately. There will be costs that only become apparent when the immediate crisis fades, and there is finally space and quiet enough for the accounting to happen. His relationship with loss, in particular, would have changed. The Emperor of the Great Crusade could be, and often was, callous about individual loss in the service of larger goals. He sacrificed the Thunder Warriors who unified Terra and replaced them with Space Marines, without the kind of personal reckoning that loss of life on that scale should have prompted. He made decisions about individuals and about groups of people that were strategically sound but personally brutal, and he seems to have been able to compartmentalize the personal cost of those decisions in ways that allowed him to continue functioning. Whether that compartmentalization still holds after 10,000 years of watching, from inside the warp, the consequences of every choice he ever made, is uncertain. A being capable of genuine grief is also a being capable of genuine wisdom in a way that pure strategic calculation cannot match. The Emperor who returns may be, paradoxically, more effective as a leader precisely because he is less capable of the kind of emotional compartmentalization that characterized his Great Crusade-era decision-making. The willingness to acknowledge that choices have costs, to sit with those costs rather than moving immediately to the next tactical problem, is one of the things that distinguishes leadership that creates lasting positive change from leadership that simply achieves immediate goals. The galaxy needs him to survive, and more than survive, to build something that will endure after he is gone. But he has also, in some sense, earned something for himself after 10,000 years of service. The right to be a person rather than simply a force. The right to grieve what has been lost, to acknowledge his own failures and their consequences, to have, for the first time in his extraordinarily long existence, the kind of personal honesty with himself and with others that the demands of an eternal war have always made impossible. What he does with that possibility is between him and whatever he has become after 10,000 years in the warp. But the possibility exists. And in a setting defined by the absence of hope and the persistence of darkness, possibilities matter more than certainties. They always have. The Emperor of Mankind, waking from 10,000 years of dreaming, carries the weight of 36 billion deaths and the hope of trillions of lives. He steps out of that throne carrying everything humanity has ever been, and everything humanity might yet become. He is not perfect. He was never perfect. But he is genuinely, deeply, stubbornly committed to the survival and the flourishing of the species that bore him. And in the grim darkness of the far future, that commitment, maintained at such cost for so long, is as close to divinity as anything in the universe has ever managed to be. Whether that is enough to save the galaxy, only the galaxy's story can answer. But it is, without question, the best chance the galaxy has. The galaxy's last question: what does the Emperor want for himself? We have spent the entirety of this exploration thinking about what the Emperor's return means for everyone else. For the Imperium, for the Chaos Gods, for the Primarchs, for the Eldar and the Necrons and the Tyranids, for the ordinary human beings who populate the 42 million worlds under the Imperial banner. But there is one question we have avoided, almost deliberately, as if it were somehow inappropriate to ask. What does the Emperor want for himself? He has spent 48,000 years as a perpetual, dying and returning, each time carrying forward everything he was before, and adding to it everything the experience of dying taught him. He has spent 10,000 years on the Golden Throne, in a state that can barely be called living, sustaining everything through sheer force of will, while his body rots around the persistence of his consciousness. He has never, in the entire course of his extraordinarily long existence, had the luxury of simply being, of choosing a life for himself rather than the life that the needs of the galaxy demanded. What would it mean to the Emperor, after all of this, to be free? Not free from responsibility, because a being of his nature would never choose that, and it is not available to him anyway. The galaxy is what it is, and he is what he is, and the work is not finished, and never will be finished, in any time frame he might live to see, but free in the smaller, more personal sense. Free to have conversations that are not strategic assessments. Free to see things that are not threats to be evaluated. Free to feel, properly and fully, all of the things that 10,000 years of fighting a war in the warp, while your body decays around you, forced you to suppress or deny. He would want to see Sanguinius honored properly. His most beloved son, the angel who died defending the Golden Throne against Horus, so that his father could live long enough to deal the killing blow. The Blood Angels carry Sanguinius's memory with extraordinary devotion, but the Emperor has never had the opportunity to participate in that remembrance, to stand with his son's inheritors, and acknowledge what Sanguinius gave, and what that cost, and what it means. That moment, quietly, without strategic calculation, simply as a father mourning a son who died for him, would matter to him in ways that are not reducible to Imperium management. He would want to understand the Eldar, fully and honestly, in a way that the pressures of the Great Crusade, and then the Horus Heresy, and then the Golden Throne, never permitted. They are a species of extraordinary antiquity, and extraordinary beauty, and extraordinary tragedy, and they have been navigating the same darkness that humanity faces, with the disadvantage of being fewer and older, and more aware of exactly how much they have already lost. There is genuine respect there, under the strategic calculation, and the possibility of genuine conversation, in the absence of immediate emergency, would be something the Emperor would pursue. He would want to walk on Terra again, not the Terra of the 42nd millennium, covered in the architecture of an empire, but whatever version of it is still accessible. In the deepest levels of the palace and the oldest preserved spaces, where the bones of what Earth was before the Imperium can still be found if you know where to look. He walked those same places 48,000 years ago, under different names, in different bodies, when the planet was alive in ways it cannot be now. But the geological bones are still there, and the Emperor, who has always been something more than simply a political figure or a military commander, who has always been, at some level, a being who remembers what the world was before humans changed it, and who carries that memory as both loss and source of strength, would want to stand in those places one more time. These are small things, measured against the scale of what we have spent the last several hours discussing. Tiny personal moments in the context of galaxy-spanning wars, and the fate of civilizations, and the reshaping of the relationship between humanity and the warp. But they are also, in a different sense, the most important things. Because the Emperor who goes back to war after allowing himself these human moments is a different Emperor from the one who has been fighting continuously for 48,000 years without pause. He is a being who has chosen, consciously and deliberately, to remain in touch with the things that make the fight worth having. The things that are not strategic assets or tactical considerations, but simply true, simply good, simply worth protecting. And in the grim darkness of the far future, where everything is a weapon and everything is a threat, and the darkness presses in from every direction without pause, that is the rarest and most necessary thing in the universe. The Emperor of mankind, waking from his long vigil on the Golden Throne, carrying 36 billion deaths and the hope of 1 trillion lives, stepping out into the cold air of a changed and wounded galaxy, with his eyes open and his mind clear and his will unbroken after 10,000 years of everything the darkness could throw at him. He is not invincible. He never was, but he is here. And the Emperor, when he is present and whole and walking, has always been the most significant thing in any room he enters, not because of his power, though his power is extraordinary, but because of what he represents. The refusal to stop, the choice, made again and again, to keep going, to keep trying, to believe that the next generation of humanity will be capable of something better than this generation managed, and to do the work of making that possible rather than accepting the comfortable certainty of decline. He sits on the throne no longer. The story is not over. It has, in a very real sense, just begun. Thank you for spending this time in the dark with me. Go and look at the stars tonight, if you have a sky where they are visible. And remember that somewhere out there, 10,000 years from now, something like them might still be burning. The Emperor protects. Subscribe if you want to keep exploring what that means.